Hello everyone, welcome to True Chilling Tales. I've made this video to help you fall asleep. Before you do that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Let me know what time it is with you and where you're watching from in the comments too. Now lay back, relax, and settle in for some chilling stories. This happened about 4 years ago when I was 20. The first time I met the man who would become my grocery store stalker, it seemed like an entirely normal interaction. It was Christmas time, and he was standing outside the store collecting donations for the Salvation Army. I'm naturally friendly, so I stopped to say hello. He was a tall guy, at least 6'4", and bore an unsettling resemblance to Lurch from the Addams Family. Dark circles under his eyes, short black hair, and a vacant expression. We chatted briefly about the weather, 2 minutes of polite small talk, before I waved goodbye and went on my way, not thinking much of it. Little did I know that this seemingly innocent moment would spiral into something that left me genuinely afraid. Months passed, and I didn't see him again. Then one day, while grocery shopping with a friend, she suddenly went quiet, her eyes wide as she recoiled. I turned to see the man standing uncomfortably close to me, less than 8 inches away. He smiled and said, "Hi, I remember you from December." Before I could even process how unnerving his presence was, he asked for my phone number. Being young and inexperienced with this kind of situation, I panicked and lied, saying I didn't know my number by heart. To deflect, I offered to take his number instead. I even pointed at my phone wallpaper, which featured my boyfriend, and made a point of saying, "That's my boyfriend," hoping it would dissuade him. It didn't. He gave me his number, which I immediately blocked the moment I walked away, ensuring he couldn't get mine in return. But then, as I put my phone away, he leaned in close, too close, and said in a low, almost conspiratorial tone, "Whatever I text you is for your eyes only." My blood ran cold. Trying to stay calm, I replied, "Sure, nice talking to you, but we need to get back to shopping." I grabbed my friend and practically dragged her away. When I asked her why she didn't step in earlier, she admitted he'd creeped her out so much that she didn't know what to do. Now, I'm not a small girl. At 5'8" and solidly built, I'm usually confident in my ability to handle myself. Rarely do I feel intimidated by anyone. But this guy, he made me feel small, vulnerable, scared. And as I would come to find out, this was only the beginning of something far more terrifying. After that encounter, I hoped I'd never see him again. Unfortunately, the opposite happened. It was as if he was always there. No matter when I went to the store, he'd appear. If I was at the checkout, he'd be at the end of the lane, watching. If I moved to a different part of the store, I'd catch him in my peripheral vision, lurking nearby. Once, I even noticed him following me to my car. That was when I decided enough was enough. I reported him to the store's managers, explaining what had been happening. They assured me they'd handle it and tell him not to speak to me. For a while, he stopped approaching me, but he didn't stop watching. Every time I went to the store, I'd feel his eyes on me. Even from a distance, the fear started to creep into my daily life. I'd dread going to the grocery store, scanning every aisle, hyper-aware of my surroundings. But I'm stubborn by nature, and I refused to let him intimidate me to the point where I'd stop living my life. Determined to confirm whether or not this was all in my head, I began paying close attention to my surroundings. What I noticed chilled me to the core. He wasn't just in the store by coincidence. He was deliberately following me. Every aisle I entered, every section I stopped in, He was there. The last time I saw him was the most terrifying encounter yet. I'd only gone to the store to grab a couple of items for dinner. As I approached, I noticed him standing outside the entrance, with his back turned. I thought I could slip in unnoticed. I hurried inside, but just a few minutes later, there he was, at the back of the store. Clutching my items, I made a beeline for the checkout. Near the front of the store, I ducked behind a shelf display, peeking out to see if he'd followed me. Sure enough, he appeared, scanning the checkout area for me. When he didn't see me, he stepped outside. At that point, my heart was racing. I darted into the nearest open cashier, quickly rang up my items, and cautiously stuck my head out the door to check for him. Not seeing him immediately, I began making my way toward my car. I'd parked a bit further away, near the side of the store where a row of smaller shops and restaurants were located. As I walked briskly toward my car, I spotted him again. He was standing by the entrance I had initially used to enter the store. My stomach dropped. I ducked behind a pillar, praying he hadn't seen me. Peeking out, I watched as he scanned the parking lot, looking for me. He didn't see me. After a tense minute or two, he started walking toward the front parking lot of the store. As soon as he was far enough away, I bolted. I ran to my car as fast as I could, jumped in, and locked the doors immediately. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the lock. Relief started to creep in, until I looked up. There he was. He stood about 15 feet from my car, pushing a shopping cart, staring directly at me. It was obvious he'd chased after me when he saw me running for my car. The cart in front of him was just an act, a cover to make it look like he was doing something harmless. But the way he looked at me, he knew I'd caught on, and I knew exactly what he was doing. I was terrified, completely frozen. As soon as I could force my limbs to move, I drove home and immediately told my grandfather everything. By the time I finished, I was crying and shaking. My grandfather, a no-nonsense kind of man, told me to get in the car. We were going to settle this. We drove back to the store in his car. My grandfather walked me inside, straight to customer service, and demanded to speak to the managers, both of them. When the managers arrived, he asked me to explain everything that had been happening. My voice wavered as I recounted the months of stalking, the way he followed me every time I came to the store, and how I'd caught him outside my car. My grandfather didn't hold back, demanding that they ensure the man stayed away from me, or he'd involve the police. The managers listened intently, swearing up and down that they'd handle it. I don't know if he was fired right away. My friend, the one who was with me during our first encounter, told me she still saw him from time to time when she went to the store alone. But whenever I was with her, he'd be nowhere in sight. It was as though he knew exactly when I was there and made a deliberate effort to avoid me. Eventually, he disappeared altogether. My friend stopped seeing him, and I assume he was either fired or moved on to a different store. Whatever the case, I haven't seen him since. Even though it's been years, I still get chills thinking about that day. The moment he made eye contact with me through my car window, the smug look on his face as if he was in control, terrifies me to this day. The idea that he could watch me so closely, knowing exactly when I came to the store, and track me or avoid me at will, still makes my skin crawl. My freshman year of college was one of the best times of my life. Wild parties, new friends, and freedom I'd never experienced before. But it was also, without a doubt, the scariest year I've ever lived through. I'm 31 now, and I still look back on it, shaking my head at how I didn't completely lose it. One story in particular haunts me to this day. It stretched out over the entire school year, leaving me rattled and questioning my sanity. I've only talked about it a handful of times in the 13 years since it happened. It all started in August 2001. Like most freshmen, I was living in the dorms at a state party school. I'd opted out of a better college I'd gotten into. After graduating from a strict military prep school, I was ready to blow off some steam. My plans didn't go much further than surviving Saturday night. My buddy Bill, who'd also gone to my prep school, was living a few floors below me in the same dorm. As soon as my parents pulled out of the parking lot, we got to work turning college life into a non-stop party. For the first month, everything was normal. Classes during the day, sometimes, partying at night, chasing girls, and just living the dream. Then, mid-September, things took a sharp turn. One night, my dorm phone rang. This was 2001, so cell phones were still a rarity. Landlines were the norm. Groggily, I answered. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was strange, robotic, almost like an old-school GPS or a computer trying to talk. "Hi, Gary, how are you today?" Confused and half asleep, I asked, "Who is this?" The voice repeated, "Hi, Gary, how are you today?" Realizing I was being messed with, I hung up, chuckling to myself. It had to be Bill. Good one. I forgot about it and went back to sleep. A week later, I got another call. Same time, same robotic voice. "Hi, Gary. I'm watching you." This time, I played along. "Very funny, Bill. Shouldn't you be swimming in Everclear or flirting with a tri-delt right now? Cut it out before my roommate gets pissed." I hung up again, more annoyed than amused. The next morning at breakfast, I casually confronted Bill, expecting him to crack a grin and own up to it. But instead, he looked genuinely confused. "What are you talking about?" he asked. I brushed it off. Maybe another friend was behind the prank. Then, a few days later, I came back to my room to find my answering machine blinking. I barely even remembered the thing worked. I pressed play, and the messages made my skin crawl. Message 1. "Hi, Gary. I'm watching you." Message 2. "I thought I asked you to answer my calls, Gary." Message 3. "Where might Gary be on a Tuesday night?" I was annoyed, but still convinced this was just a friend, with way too much time on their hands. I played the messages for my roommate, Cade, who'd known me since junior high. At first, he laughed, thinking it was a harmless prank. By the third message, though, even he was a little spooked. I started asking around. I went to my friends' rooms, casually bringing up the calls to see if anyone would slip. Nothing. No one admitted to knowing anything. Over the next few weeks, the calls kept coming. At first, once a week. Then every few days until by Christmas break, it was a daily occurrence. I was unraveling. What started as a normal freshman year spiraled into a nightmare. I skipped classes, bombed exams, and my grades tanked, landing me at a shameful 0.67 GPA. I couldn't focus on anything, let alone explain to my family why college wasn't going as planned. I didn't dare bring up the calls, convinced they'd think I was using them as an excuse. After an uneventful Christmas break, I returned to school determined to get my life back on track. But the first night back, the phone rang. It was CVG again. "How is your family in Cyprus?" My blood ran cold. Cyprus was my hometown, a small suburb no one outside my circle should know. What kind of friend drags out a prank for this long? The calls escalated. They turned darker, more threatening. "I'm very interested in being close to you, Gary." "I have tools I can bring. It is going to all be over soon." By now, my friends were in the loop. I gathered them in my room, playing the messages back to back. Hearing them all at once, the gravity of it hit everyone. They were stunned. What had started as an annoying prank had transformed into something far more sinister. The messages got specific, referencing my parents' address and detailed threats of violence. Cut open your esophagus, Gary, with a butter knife. To make things worse, CVG started mentioning Layla, a girl I'd reconnected with through AIM. She went to a school hundreds of miles away. CVG first referred to her vaguely as your friend, but soon started using her name. Your friend, Layla, won't be safe for long. I called Layla, desperate for answers, but she was just as clueless and just as scared. Thanks for sticking through the backstory. It's important to understand the context for what came next. One night, a few of us were partying at a hotel. A friend of ours, Carl, had brought his big truck, which we usually relied on to get around. But Carl was out cold after downing an entire bottle of whatever, so he wasn't driving anywhere. I wasn't drinking that night and wanted to crash in my own bed, so I grabbed his keys and decided to drive myself back to campus. My plan was to return the truck and pick everyone up the next morning. I wasn't exactly a frequent driver at the time, so I wasn't the sharpest with directions. I made a wrong turn pretty quickly, but figured I'd keep going until I hit the main highway near campus. It seemed logical enough. Before long, I found myself on a desolate road surrounded by open fields. No streetlights, no buildings, just blackness stretching out into the night. The road itself was paved, but it felt like no one had driven on it in years. Around 3 a.m., I came to this bizarre four-way stop. It felt absurd. Why have a four-way stop in the middle of nowhere? Shrugging it off, I kept going, eventually finding my way back to the familiar highway, and then to campus. I didn't think much of the detour until a few days later, when CVG interrupted his usual litany of threats to say something chillingly specific. You drove through the four-way stop at 3 a.m. My stomach dropped. How? How could he have known I was out there in the middle of nowhere, on a road I hadn't even meant to take? I hadn't told anyone about the detour. To this day, even after years working in military intelligence and tracking targets globally, I have no idea how CVG knew. From that point, the calls shifted focus. CVG began to fixate on the idea of a meeting. The threats ramped up in frequency, 10, 15 calls a day. My phone's ringer stayed off for Cade's sake, and I muted the answering machine as the calls recorded. But finally, CVG delivered the message I'd been dreading. We will meet in front of Coleman, Hall at midnight, Wednesday, 27 April, and we will take our friendship to the next level. I should mention that by this point, my situation had turned into a bizarre spectacle on campus. Everyone knew about CVG and the calls. People would knock on my door, eager to hear the messages, and my stalker saga became party gossip. To be fair, it scored me a few dates. Don't judge. As the day of the meeting approached, the dorm was buzzing with testosterone-fueled bravado. Guys were hyped, ready to defend me and get involved in this real-life horror story. By the evening, a crowd of 70 or 80 had gathered in the common area. Most of them eventually peeled off to pursue more traditional college fun. Beer bongs and sorority girls. By midnight, I was left with a smaller group of about 15 to 20. I didn't want them shadowing me to the meeting spot and risk scaring CVG off, but I made sure they stayed nearby in case things went south. Coleman Hall was only about 300 paces from our dorm, and the glass doors gave them a clear view of me as I walked out. Midnight hit, and I stepped into the night, my pulse racing. The walk felt endless. Around 100 paces out, I noticed two things at once. First, there was a quick, subtle movement on the patio walkway near Coleman Hall. Second, the normally bright bulb in that spot was out. Later, I'd learn it had been smashed. As my eyes adjusted to the dark, I saw him. Crouched behind a bush near one of the building's pillars, a figure in dark clothes and a hoodie was perfectly positioned to avoid detection. I realized I shouldn't have been able to see him at all if I hadn't looked at the exact right moment. My heart slammed in my chest as he started to rise, taking a cautious step toward me. Fight or flight kicked in, and I sprinted toward him without thinking. Behind me, my group burst through the glass doors, shouting as they followed. The figure bolted, running along the patio toward the parking lot. As I closed the distance, I realized this wasn't the mid-30s computer nerd I'd imagined. He was tall, broad, and athletic. I rounded the building's corner just in time to see him leap into the side of a running van. The van was waiting, its brake lights flickering as it shifted into gear. As the sliding door slammed shut, the van peeled out of the lot and vanished into the night. I stood there, shaking, as my friends caught up. A few had seen the scene unfold, but no one had gotten a license plate number. As we retraced our steps, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. Near the bush where CVG had been crouching, there was a video camera on a tripod. It was pointed directly at the spot where I was supposed to stand for our meeting. It was still recording. This is a bit of a long story, so settle in. To give you some context, I'm from a city in the northeast of Scotland, UK. What I'm about to share didn't just affect me. It also involved two close friends, Debbie and Joe, not their real names. We all worked at Virgin Megastore, a job that brought us together as a tight-knit group of music and movie enthusiasts. I started there in 2003, Debbie joined in 2006, and Joe in 2007. The staff were like a second family, bonded by our shared interests and sense of humor. Every Christmas, the store hired temporary staff to handle the holiday rush. In 2007, one of those temps was Rory, his real name. Rory fit in almost immediately. He was a young guy, passionate about music, especially Pink Floyd, which was a big hit with Joe, an incredible guitarist, and me, who grew up on their music. Rory also had a love for filmmaking, and our shared interests made it easy to get along. Unlike most temps, Rory stayed in touch after the holiday season. He didn't live in the same city as us, but he kept connected through texts and social media, occasionally coming into town to hang out. By Christmas 2008, Virgin Megastore had become Zavi Entertainment, and Rory returned to work with us as a temp. I managed the stockroom, and he became my right-hand man. Rory could be a little intense, especially with his obsession over rare Pink Floyd live tracks, but he worked hard, and we had a lot of laughs. At the same time, Rory was putting together a self-made Pink Floyd documentary, even interviewing Joe and me for it. Given his limited tools, I was impressed with the result. In February 2009, Zavi shut down due to the global financial crisis. Despite this, the Zavi crew stayed close, organizing reunions and keeping in touch. In 2010, Rory even organized a reunion night out, which most of the local staff attended. By then, Rory was preparing to head to America for his second summer working as a camp counselor at Camp Wigwam in Maine. That Christmas, he returned as a temp at my new retail job, and I welcomed him back, at first. Things started to shift in 2011. Rory raised some red flags that I didn't immediately recognize as troubling. He claimed he'd landed a job working on the show Burn Notice during his summers in America, handling editing and camera work. It sounded impressive, and I congratulated him, believing it was true. He also said he was working with Camp America in Florida, which supposedly led to the Burn Notice gig. At the same time, Rory's behavior started to grate on me. He insisted on being the center of every Zavi reunion, even though he'd only been a temp. His Facebook posts hyped up casual gatherings like major events, which annoyed me, but I brushed it off as youthful enthusiasm. He also teamed up with a mutual friend to scout locations for a film, but my friend later confided that Rory spent the entire day asking basic questions about favorite directors instead of contributing any real ideas. By 2012, Rory became closer to Debbie, a stunning and kind-hearted friend I'd always seen as a sister. Debbie and Rory started hanging out, nothing unusual at first, but when Rory returned as a temp that Christmas, the cracks in his charm became obvious to more people. He began bragging about working on shows like Criminal Minds and The Wire alongside Burn Notice. Coworkers found his stories dubious and his tone increasingly smug, but because they knew I was friendly with him, they avoided sharing their frustrations with me. Things came to a head during a planned Zavi reunion. Rory texted me the day before, claiming everyone was going to a pub quiz, a setting he knew I avoided for personal reasons. Feeling excluded, I didn't go, only to later find out the pub quiz was a fabrication. When Joe visited me at work the next day, Rory tagged along, inserting himself into the conversation and answering questions directed at Joe as if he were his spokesperson. It was infuriating, but I kept quiet, not wanting to stir up drama. Joe, ever the happy-go-lucky type, didn't even notice Rory's behavior. By this point, Rory's obsession with Joe and his guitar skills had reached unhealthy levels, and I started avoiding contact with him. Debbie and Joe, however, were still charmed by him, so I tolerated him for their sake. Then, in early 2013, Rory claimed his father had suffered a life-threatening stroke, leaving him severely disabled. This later turned out to be a lie, a calculated attempt to gain sympathy, especially from Debbie and Joe. By 2014, things started to shift in a big way. Joe had moved back from Glasgow and was now renting Debbie's spare room, which seemed to bring them all even closer, except for me. Despite hanging out with Rory recently, and even letting him stay at my place multiple times over the years, I started to feel like I was being phased out of the group. Rory organized trips to 3 different Prince concerts across the UK with Debbie, Joe, and another ex-Zavi friend, but I wasn't invited. At first, I was furious, but in hindsight, I'm relieved. Rory had paid for all the tickets, which raised another red flag. He wasn't working much outside of his seasonal temp jobs or his supposed freelance photography and video editing gigs. Yet he was throwing cash around for concerts and travel. It didn't add up, and I started wondering where his money was coming from. After those gigs, I blocked Rory on social media. His posts and comments were infuriating, constantly undermining people or picking fights over trivial differences of opinion. Debbie took issue with me blocking him, defending him staunchly. In hindsight, I realized she'd been groomed, viewing him through rose-tinted glasses. Against my better judgment, I caved and reconnected, unwilling to lose my friendship with Debbie and Joe, even though I knew deep down there was something deeply off about Rory. Throughout 2014, Debbie and Rory became inseparable. From an outsider's perspective, their social media photos made them look like a couple. Over the next 2 years, my connection to the group faded. Rory's visits to my place became increasingly bizarre. He'd come over under the guise of needing a place to crash before an early flight for a video editing job in the US, only for me to find out he'd gone back to his mom's house in the village instead. His lies piled up, and I quietly began distancing myself. I unfollowed Debbie, Joe, and Rory on social media, hiding my posts from them entirely. My plan was simple. If I bumped into them in public, I'd be polite, but keep it brief. Around this time, I started digging into Rory's stories about his time in America. I shared his claims with a friend and their flatmate, who had lived in the US for years. They were adamant. There was no way Rory's claims about working on shows like Burn Notice were true. Camp America strictly limits participants to working as camp counselors, and my research confirmed that Rory's camp wasn't even in Florida, as he claimed. Meanwhile, Rory's spending habits baffled everyone. Friends who still followed him on Facebook asked me, "Where is he getting his money?" He was attending expensive concerts across the UK almost weekly, some costing up to £200 per ticket, plus travel and accommodation. His excuses didn't add up. He claimed to make money from YouTube, but his channel had barely any subscribers, and most of his content was filled with copyrighted material. Then there was the secret second Facebook account. Its profile picture was of him and Debbie. I took a screenshot and showed her, but she dismissed it, saying, "Oh, that's just his American account." I couldn't believe how blind she was to the truth. By October 2018, I had completely severed ties with Rory. I'd even missed Debbie's wedding the previous year, where Rory had been a bridesman. I hadn't seen Joe in ages and had moved on with my life. Then, one afternoon at work, a friend came rushing into the room. "Hey, have you heard Rory was in court?" they asked, their voice urgent. My first thought was tax evasion or copyright infringement. "What for?" I asked, half joking. The truth hit me like a freight train. "For making videos of little kids," my friend said. Between January and November 2017, Rory had been pretending to be a girl online, using platforms like YouTube and Omegle to groom young boys. I was furious. An adrenaline-fueled rage consumed me for 17 hours straight. I couldn't believe it. All those years of feeling like something was wrong, all the red flags I couldn't piece together, had been right. He was a predator, and my friends had been completely duped. But worse than that were the poor kids he had exploited. The source of his expendable income suddenly clicked. I believe he was selling those videos on the dark web for Bitcoin profit. He was the first person to ever mention the dark web to me, casually warning, "Oh, never go there." Looking back, it was chilling. Rory eventually pled guilty. He was sentenced to 3 years and 9 months in prison, received a 5-year sexual harm prevention order, and was placed on the sex offenders register for life. Even now, I can't shake the anger and disgust. I'll never forget the way he manipulated everyone around him, or the devastation he caused to those kids and their families. If nothing else, I'm relieved he's behind bars, but part of me will always wonder how many more lives he damaged before he was caught. This is an old story my dad has told me a few times over the years, but with Halloween coming up, it's been on my mind again. I've never seen the house myself, but from the vivid descriptions I've gotten, repeated consistently by several men decades later, I can picture it clearly in my head. For context, my dad is a deeply religious man, a preacher's son, and he doesn't believe in ghosts or anything remotely paranormal. He's not the type to scare easily either, but he swears up and down that what happened that night was unlike anything he's ever experienced, and even just talking about it, years later, sends a visible chill through him. Back in the late 80s, my dad and his friends used to hike through the waterfall and creek bed behind our farm, following trails that eventually met the frontage road by the interstate. One night, they decided to take a different route, looping around the back of another farmer's property. The farmer owned emus and other exotic animals, which was unusual for the area, so they were curious to check it out. After leaving the farm and heading deeper into the woods, at night no less, they stumbled upon what they later described as a house straight out of the Blair Witch Project. It was a decrepit, eerie old home that looked like it had been abandoned for decades. My dad says just looking at it filled him with an ominous sense of dread. Naturally, though, curiosity got the better of them, and they decided to go inside. The interior was like something out of a nightmare. The house seemed to be a vintage cottage, probably built in the late 40s or early 50s, but the walls were covered in strange symbols and writing. Some of the markings looked like they were in a Latin-like language, while others were in English, quoting what seemed to be satanic or pagan rituals. These writings detailed sacrifices, human sacrifices, to some kind of deity. According to my dad, some of the symbols were painted in what looked like blood, while others were clearly spray-painted graffiti. And here's the thing. He worked as a firefighter for years and had seen his fair share of human blood in accidents. He insists that what he saw on those walls wasn't just red paint. Beyond the initial living and kitchen area was a narrow stairwell. It was so tight that their shoulders brushed against the walls as they climbed. The stairs went straight up, stopped at a landing, then turned sharply to the right. From the bottom, they couldn't see what was waiting at the top. When they reached the top, they found themselves in a large attic-like bedroom. The room was horrifying. Chain manacles and locks hung from the wall, near a circular window. The floors and walls were stained with large, dried puddles of blood, and the entire space was covered in the same strange symbols and graffiti. As they explored the room, they all suddenly heard footsteps, quick, deliberate footsteps coming up the stairs behind them. The sound was distinct, like heels clacking on wood. Startled, they turned to look, but no one was there. The footsteps stopped as abruptly as they had started. Completely spooked, they rushed downstairs, convinced someone had to be playing a prank on them. But when they searched the lower level, they found nothing, no one, and no footprints in the thick dust and grime except their own from when they had first entered. Years later, I decided to ask each of the men who had been there about the experience, hoping to find some inconsistency in their stories that might explain what had happened. But when I spoke to them individually, each one gave me the exact same account, down to the smallest details, without hesitation. It still gives me chills to think about. My dad doesn't bring it up often, but when he does, you can see how much it still unsettles him. Whatever they stumbled upon that night wasn't something they'll ever forget. The guys all remembered the same details, the exact minute they entered the house and the exact minute they left. But here's where it gets really strange. After leaving the house, for reasons none of them can explain, they decided to test a different route back. Using a compass, they planned to approach from the east instead of the south. They repeated this experiment over 10 times that night, walking toward the house from every possible direction. Yet no matter where they started, north, east, or west, they always ended up back at the front entrance of the house. This wasn't just disorienting. It was downright impossible. The compass readings and their knowledge of the woods, knowledge they had honed over years, confirmed they were moving in a straight line. And yet, they kept winding up at the south end of the house. There's probably a scientific explanation for it, but I haven't found one yet. These men knew those woods like the back of their hand, and still do to this day. Dad. The last time they found themselves standing at the front door, things took an even darker turn. They started feeling physically sick, like a fever was setting in. That's when they decided it was time to give up and leave for good. But just as they turned to go, one of them, who was nearly fainting from exhaustion, glanced back. He froze. Then he pointed, trembling, at the circular window on the second story of the house. Everyone turned to look, and there she was. A tall, hunched female figure stood in the window, watching them. She had no discernible facial features, except for 2 large, dark eyes. She shuffled slightly, as though shifting her weight, then turned and moved away from the window, as if heading toward the stairs at the far end of the room. At that moment, panic hit. The group bolted, running blindly through the woods until they finally emerged on the side of the interstate. 3 miles from my dad's house, where they had started. Even as they made their way home, they couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. When they got back to my dad's place, his cousin went into the kitchen to grab some water. Moments later, he came back pale as a sheet, swearing he had just seen the same figure standing at the edge of the woods near the shed. Thankfully, nothing else came of the experience, but the terror it left behind was enough. My dad and his friends dismissed his cousin's sighting as paranoia or pareidolia. Even so, 5 years later, curiosity got the better of them, and they decided to check if the house was still there. When they arrived, they found only a pile of rubble. The house had collapsed in on itself, leaving nothing but ruins. They never went back again. I used to joke with my dad about it, teasing him by asking what he'd do if he returned and found the house standing exactly as it had back then. I even tried to convince him to let me go see the spot myself, but between trespassing laws and the risk of running into angry property owners, it was a non-starter. Even now, the story gives me the creeps. For a long time, I didn't believe it was true. But then I did a little mock interview with the guys who were there, hoping to find cracks in their stories. I didn't. Every single one of them gave me the same account without hesitation. And when I tell you these grown men are still scared to death by what they saw that night, I mean it. Watching them get visibly worked up and shaken, just talking about it, made me rethink my skepticism. So, I recently bought a small bass boat, and my first mate, Legoff, and I have been super excited to explore the lake, its islands, and learn the ropes of fishing around here. We're new to Tennessee, so everything feels like an adventure. Yesterday, on the 4th of July, we decided to head out to this really secluded part of the lake that we've nicknamed No Man's Land. It's blocked off by a low-hanging bridge that keeps most boaters out, but my little boat can squeeze underneath, so it feels like our secret spot. This time, we decided to venture deeper into the cove than ever before. As we trolled slowly down the lake, the path split into 3 forks. I asked Legoff which way to go, and without hesitation he said, "The middle one." So we kept straight, and as the water narrowed into a river-like channel, things started to feel off. What happened next was a chain of events that unfolded fast. We've talked about it since, trying to piece together the exact order, but here's what we remember. First, we heard this strange, vocal-like noise coming from the woods along the shoreline. It wasn't loud, but it made both of us freeze. "What was that?" Legoff asked. "A dog," I said automatically, though I didn't believe it even as the words came out. "I don't think that was a dog," Legoff replied, his voice uneasy. Then we saw a bird perched high above us on a branch, just staring. "Maybe it was that bird," Legoff suggested. "Yeah, maybe," I answered, though I wasn't convinced. Somewhere during all of this, I realized I'd drawn my pistol without even thinking about it, holding it down at my side. Legoff had the fishing bow ready. We both felt it, the overwhelming sense that we were being watched. We drifted past a rotting pine tree, half submerged in the water along the shore. That's when it happened. Out of nowhere, we heard heavy, pounding footsteps crashing through the woods. They were fast, deliberate, and getting closer. At first, I thought, deer? The sound was almost prancing, but as it got louder and closer, we both realized this wasn't a deer. A massive jet-black canine burst through the trees. My brain tried to rationalize it. Coyote. But it was way too big. This thing was the size of a huge German shepherd, maybe larger, and it was fast. It moved like a shadow, zigzagging between the trees, leaping with incredible speed toward the exact stretch of shoreline we were floating past. But something about it didn't look right. It didn't have the texture or detail of a normal animal. No visible fur, no face or eyes we could make out. Just this flat, blurry outline of a canine with tall, wolf-like ears. But it was unmistakably a canine shape, and it was coming straight for us. Adrenaline hit hard. My mind raced, trying to prepare for what might happen. It looked like it was charging us, but with the 15 feet of water between the boat and the shore, I felt a small sense of relief. It'd have to swim out to us, and I figured that wasn't likely. The creature reached the shoreline in seconds. Without hesitation, in one smooth, fluid motion, it leapt off the bank and dove into the water, right under the half-submerged pine tree we'd just passed. Stomp, 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 splash, and then nothing. We held our breath, waiting for it to resurface, to hear it swimming or moving toward us. All we saw were faint ripples spreading out from the splash, small and unimpressive for something that size. Afterward, Legov kept saying the same thing. For how big it was, the splash should have been much bigger. We didn't stick around to find out more. Watch for it to come back up, I whispered, my voice barely audible. I've never heard of canines being able to submerge themselves underwater, but there it was, right in front of us. We waited. Nothing. Just silence, broken only by the faint sound of ripples slowly fading away. We stayed frozen, staring at the spot where the creature had disappeared, our eyes locked on the fallen pine tree it had leapt under. Maybe it's just standing in the water under the tree, Legov said, his voice uneasy. Summoning what little courage we had left, we trolled the boat a little closer to inspect the tree. Nothing. No sign of it at all. At this point, we were in complete shock, stunned. How could it just be gone? A creature that size doesn't just vanish. We sat there for another 30 seconds in tense silence, scanning the shoreline and the water. Finally, Legov broke it. You saw what I saw, right? A shiver ran down my spine. All of it, I replied. Really, though, what the fuck was that? Legov asked, his voice louder now. I swallowed hard and said, I think we saw a demon. We both laughed nervously, the kind of laugh that doesn't feel real because you're still too shaken to process anything. We stayed floating near the shoreline for at least another 10 minutes, still trying to piece together what had just happened. Legov kept scanning the water, waiting for it to surface, but it never did. How could something that big, a huge, black, wolf-like creature, just disappear into thin air or water? Being skeptics, we wanted a logical explanation. There had to be one, right? But nothing added up. If it had just splashed into the water and gotten back out, then we would have seen it walking away. We would have heard it. Anything that big would have made noise on the leaves and underbrush. But instead, there was only silence. The loudest, heaviest silence I've ever felt. We're still shaken up by it, honestly. We live in Middle Tennessee, if that helps anyone figure out what the hell this could have been. We've been racking our brains for answers, but we're coming up empty. Whatever it was, we'll never forget that day. When I was 15, I had a summer job a few miles from my house. We lived in a rural, wooded area, and my parents were pretty strict about not letting me go into the woods alone. But since they both worked during the day, and my job started at noon, I had to walk to work. Against their rules and better judgment, I decided to take a shortcut through the woods instead of sticking to the road. It shaved about a mile off my walk, and I figured, what could go wrong? Every day, at the same time, I'd head out, walking through the deserted state forest. I followed a narrow deer path for about a mile until it connected to a set of railroad tracks. From there, I'd walk a couple more miles into town to get to my job. Looking back, yeah, it was a dumb move, but at 15, I didn't think much about it. The shortcut always gave me the creeps. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, but I convinced myself it was just paranoia. My parents were big on warning me about the dangers of the woods, and I assumed their voices in my head were making me uneasy. Still, it was cooler, shadier, and quicker than the road, so I ignored my gut and stuck with it. They had no idea I was doing this either. They'd pick me up after work, blissfully unaware of my little routine. For weeks, everything went fine, until one day. I was deep in the woods, about a mile away from any houses, when I spotted something on the trail ahead of me. 2 pages ripped out of a porn magazine, lying there on the path. They hadn't been there the day before. I froze. It wasn't just random trash, it was too deliberate. Someone had put them there, and given how deserted this area was, they had to be meant for me. My stomach dropped. I wanted to turn back, but at that point, it would have been a longer hike to get out of the woods the other way. Plus, I'd have to climb a huge hill to get back home, and there was no one around to help if anything went wrong. So I kept walking, my heart racing with every step. This part of the woods was thick with brambles, dogwood, and rolling hills, so it was hard to see very far in any direction. And that's when I heard it. Footsteps. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but every time I stopped walking, the sound stopped too. It was faint, but distinct, like someone had loose change jingling in their pocket. Definitely not an animal. The thick trees and the way sound echoed made it impossible to tell where it was coming from. I tried stopping again, just to test myself. And sure enough, as soon as I paused, the footsteps stopped too. That's when it hit me. I wasn't alone. I was being followed. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, and my vision blurred with fear. But my instincts were crystal clear. Don't speak. Don't run. Just keep walking. I stuck to the dense deer path, heading further into the woods, my gut screaming not to look back. I didn't know why, but I could feel it. Someone was right behind me, close enough that I could sense them, but I refused to turn around. Now here's the thing. I'm short and on the chubby side. Always have been. If you saw me, you'd probably think I couldn't outrun anyone, let alone in the middle of the woods. And honestly, that's probably what this creep was thinking too. But here's what they didn't know. I ran cross-country and track back then. I wasn't Olympic material or anything, but I could do a 7-minute mile, and hills were my specialty. I always did well on hilly courses, so while I didn't consciously think through all of this in the moment, somewhere deep down, I knew. Don't run. Not yet. So I kept walking, further into the woods, trying to act like nothing was wrong. My legs felt like jelly. My heart was pounding out of my chest, and everything around me blurred like I was walking through a nightmare. It was a feeling I've never experienced before or since. A primal, you're prey right now kind of terror. I didn't scream. I didn't even glance back. I just knew nobody would hear me if I did. I headed toward the train tracks, which I knew weren't far off. They'd give me the space I needed to run. Clear ground, no branches to trip over. But the closer I got, the more I could feel them behind me. Just 5 or 10 feet back, following me like a shadow for what felt like forever. maybe an eighth of a mile. Still, I didn't look back. I didn't even breathe differently. I just kept moving. As soon as the train tracks came into view, elevated on a gravel mound, I made my move. I bolted. Full speed. I scrambled up the hill on all fours, grabbing at weeds to haul myself up faster. And then I was sprinting along the tracks, lungs and legs burning, giving it everything I had. Behind me, I heard branches snapping in the woods below. I couldn't see who, or what, was there, because the woods were so dark compared to the sunlight on the tracks. I just ran. I never actually saw the person, but I didn't need to. I knew their intentions were bad. Terrible, even. And after that, I never took the deer path shortcut again. I didn't tell my parents about it either. Not until I was 18 and out of the house. I was more scared of being grounded back then than I was of explaining what happened. Picture this. I'm about 15 or 16 years old, and it's the middle of winter, around 7 p.m. I'm coming down with a mild cold, the kind that makes you feel just unwell enough to want to stay cozy. My parents aren't home, and my sister is off at a school event, so I decide to take advantage of the quiet house and run a hot bath. About 10 minutes in, as I'm starting to relax, I hear a knock at the front door. At first, it doesn't seem odd. My family has a habit of losing their keys or forgetting something, so I assume it's one of them needing help. I get out of the bath, wrap myself in a robe, and start walking toward the door. But before I reach it, something makes me stop. I don't know why, but this uneasy feeling washes over me. Instead of opening the door, I grab my phone and send a quick text to my parents. Hey, is one of you locked out? As I wait for a reply, the knocking gets louder and more forceful. My dog, crated in the living room, starts barking, loud and sharp. Then my phone buzzes, and it's a call from my dad. I pick up, and his response makes my stomach drop. Nope. I'm still at your sister's school event. Here's the adjusted continuation of your story, maintaining the tension and urgency. My dog's barking made me uneasy. She wasn't a quiet dog by any means, but she never barked at me or my family. Something about her reaction felt wrong. I decided to stay quiet and tiptoe out of the bathroom into my sister's room, which was right next to the front door. Her window blinds gave me a clear view of the porch. I pulled them back just enough to peek outside, and my heart sank. Standing at the door was a man I didn't recognize. He was wearing all black, with ragged hair and a crowbar in one hand. In his pocket, I could just make out the shape of something that looked like a gun. He pounded on the door again, this time with both hands, and my dog went ballistic. She barked like she was ready to break out of her crate, her growls reverberating through the house. Then I saw him step back from the door and motion toward a car parked in the driveway. My stomach churned as another man got out and walked up onto the porch. That was enough for me. I ran to the living room and opened my dog's crate. She bolted out, barking so loudly it was almost deafening. Her growls were low and guttural, and she threw herself at the door, clawing and snarling. She was relentless, so loud that she had to pause to take labored breaths before barking again. Through the commotion, I heard one of the men mutter, "Oh, fuck, nah," just before the slam of a car door and the crunch of gravel as the car sped away. I stood there shaking, holding on to my dog's collar as she continued barking at the now empty porch. When my dad rushed home, I could barely get the words out as I explained what had happened. We searched the yard and porch together, hoping to find some evidence of who they were or why they'd come. The only thing we found? Deep dents on the walls where the man had pounded his fists. Back in 2002, I was a single mother in my mid-40s, living in Altoona, Pennsylvania. My 4-year-old son and I had just moved into a new house, trying to settle into a fresh start. We'd only been there a few weeks when, late one night, there was an unexpected knock at the front door. My son was fast asleep on the couch, and I was still up unpacking and organizing boxes, trying to make the place feel like home. Curious but cautious, I pulled back the curtain to peek outside. Standing on the porch was a petite young woman, shivering in the cold. I hesitated before opening the door. It had a chain latch, and I made sure to keep it secured as I opened it, just enough to speak to her. "Can I help you?" I asked. The woman's voice trembled as she explained that she'd locked herself out of her house. She asked if she could come in to use my phone. "Where do you live?" I asked, trying to sound neutral. She described an address, a house about a block away, just around the corner. But something about her story felt off. If she'd locked herself out, why had she come to my house? She would have passed at least half a dozen others with porch lights on. There was also a payphone across the street, a still operational one, yet she didn't seem to have considered it. Alarm bells were going off in my head. I glanced back at my son, peacefully asleep in the living room. The thought of letting a stranger into my house with him there made me uneasy. But it was a bitterly cold winter night, and she was visibly shivering. Trying to balance caution with kindness, I told her I couldn't let her in, but offered her a coat and my cell phone, which I passed to her through the small opening in the doorway. She took the coat and phone with a quiet, "Thank you," but immediately walked to the far end of the porch, out of earshot, as she made her call. My unease deepened, but I kept watching her through the door's small opening. After a few moments, I reminded her to leave the phone in the mailbox when she was done, and to bring the coat back tomorrow. She didn't say much, just nodded, before walking off into the cold night. I closed the door and locked it firmly behind me. True to her word, she left the phone in the mailbox. But the coat, that was never returned. At first, I brushed it off as one of those strange encounters you chalk up to life. But then, the phone calls started. For weeks afterward, I'd get calls at all hours of the day and night. Sometimes there'd be nothing but silence on the other end. Other times, strangers would demand to know where I was. I'd answer, confused and unnerved, only to have them hang up abruptly. It was unsettling, but I tried to move on and focus on my son. Then, 2 or 3 months later, I picked up the local Altoona newspaper. The front page stopped me cold. There was her photo, the young woman from my porch that winter night. She and 10 other suspects had been arrested in a major drug bust. Chills ran down my spine as the memories of that night came flooding back. I thought about her standing there in the freezing cold, wearing only a sleeveless shirt. How she had passed several well-lit homes in the neighborhood just to knock on mine. The creeping feeling that something wasn't right, that had stayed with me ever since. And then I thought about what could have happened. If I'd ignored my gut instincts, if I'd let her into the house, what might she have done? I glanced over at my son, playing on the floor with his toys, blissfully unaware of the danger that might have been. I'll never know for sure, but that night left an imprint on me. A reminder to trust my instincts, no matter how helpless someone might seem. I'm 22 years old, working in the medical field as a floater medical technician. My job takes me to various assisted living, skilled nursing, and independent living facilities across the state. Every week, I get a new schedule that can put me anywhere from 30 minutes to 3 hours away from home. Sometimes the days drag on late into the night, but I don't mind too much. I've always been used to long drives. My parents used to call 4-hour road trips day trips, so I learned to roll with it. Where I live is pretty rural. Lots of back roads and forests stretching for miles. The kind of place that would feel eerie in a scary story, with its dark, winding roads and endless trees. But for me, the woods have always been more peaceful than unsettling. I've lived around them my whole life. This particular night was no different, at first. I'd just finished up at a clinic around 6 p.m. It was winter, so it was already dark. Tired and hungry, I was ready for the hour and 45-minute drive back home. The first half hour of the trip was easy enough. Smooth highways, lo-fi music playing softly as I decompressed. Then I saw it. A massive crash up ahead. 4, maybe 5 cars, completely tangled in a nasty pileup. The highway was gridlocked, and it was obvious I wasn't going anywhere soon. I decided to take the next exit, figuring I'd cut through some back roads and get home faster than waiting for the wreckage to clear. The detour led me through a small, forgotten town. Calling it a town felt generous. The place looked like something out of a post-apocalyptic movie. Boarded-up houses, crumbling buildings, no lights, no cars, nothing. The roads were cracked and uneven, so I had to slow down to avoid stressing my car. My tires groaned as they rolled over potholes, and the suspension wasn't much happier. It was dead silent. No signs of life anywhere, just the faint crunch of my tires and the hum of my engine. I've seen run-down places before, but this one felt wrong. Still, I pressed on, creeping along at 15 or 20 miles an hour with my brights cutting through the darkness. As I passed an abandoned fire department, I heard it. A loud thunk on the roof of my car. I froze. Panicked. I pulled into the parking lot of the fire department and jumped out, heart racing. I expected to see a tree branch or maybe a chunk of debris denting the roof of my car, but when I looked, there was nothing there. Puzzled, I walked around to the back of the car, thinking maybe whatever it was had rolled off. But the road behind me was empty. No branches, no rocks, nothing. I chalked it up to something harmless, like a bird or bat hitting my car and flying away, though it didn't sit right. Shaken, I climbed back inside and locked the doors. As I sat there, trying to collect myself, the silence pressed in. That's when I heard it. A piercing, blood-curdling scream ripped through the night. It sounded human, but so raw and agonized that it made my skin crawl. The kind of scream that makes you picture someone in unimaginable pain, their vocal cords about to snap. I didn't wait to find out who or what it was. I locked the doors, gripped the steering wheel, and pulled back onto the road. It's just a bobcat, I kept telling myself, gripping the steering wheel with trembling hands. Bobcats scream like women in distress. It's something I'd heard plenty of times before. Nothing unusual. Just a bobcat. Or maybe some kids playing a prank. Or even a homeless person. I clung to these thoughts as my car rattled along the uneven road. I pushed the speed to a modest 35 miles per hour, which for my poor, overworked car, affectionately named Orangeberry, was more than enough stress. I promised myself I'd make it up to her with a good wash later. The road stretched on, quiet and eerie, as I crept through the desolate town. The broken signs let me know I was only a mile away from the highway. My breathing began to settle. Nothing's wrong, I thought. Just a creepy little detour. I reached for my phone on the passenger seat, thinking some lo-fi music might help calm my nerves. But before I could grab it, something rushed through the edge of my headlights. I screamed and slammed on the brakes, heart pounding in my chest. It hadn't been close. Whatever it was had been at the farthest reach of my brights. But my mind raced. My body reacted before I could rationalize it. Tears blurred my vision as I clutched the wheel, trying to keep driving. It's just an animal, I told myself, over and over again. Just an animal. But then I saw it. Standing on the sidewalk, as if politely waiting for me to pass, was something wrong. It was tall, unnaturally tall. Its face was sunken, almost skeletal, and its naked body hung with loose, sagging skin that piled at its joints, wrists, knees, ankles, even around its neck and jaw. Folds of flesh drooped grotesquely, illuminated for only a half second by my headlights before I hit the gas. "Sorry, Orangeberry," I muttered as I floored it. "I'll make it up to you." Panic consumed me. I was screaming obscenities now, my voice rising above the sound of the engine. "What the fuck? What the fuck? What the fuck?" My hands gripped the wheel so tightly, I left nail marks in the leather. Goosebumps spread across my body as adrenaline coursed through me. I swerved onto the highway, recklessly veering into the other lane, desperate to get away. I drove 80 miles per hour for a while, before finally pulling over to the side of the road. My chest heaved as I broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. I called my dad, barely able to get the words out. He answered immediately, his voice filled with concern. Through my tears, I told him everything, or at least as much as I could. I called it a man in a scary monster costume, because what else could I say? Dad's response was firm. "Call the police." I didn't want to. The idea of explaining it all, or worse, going back to that town with someone, was too much. But Dad wouldn't let it go. So I called. "I saw a man in the town back there," I told the dispatcher. "In a costume. He scared me really bad." The dispatcher asked a few questions, then assured me they'd send someone to check it out. They told me to head home. I don't know what it was. I don't know if it was a costume or something else entirely. Maybe it was just bad lighting, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But I can tell you this. If it was a costume, it was the most hyper-realistic thing I've ever seen. I could make out every fold of sagging skin, every wrinkle, even a few faint blue veins. It's been a month since that night. I haven't heard anything from the police. No updates, no calls. I couldn't even tell you the name of the town. It's like it disappeared as soon as I left it. I'm doing better now, but I've changed. I don't feel safe outside my car at night anymore. Not even for the short walk from my front door to the driveway. The dark feels suffocating. And if I'm outside for more than a few seconds, I start shaking uncontrollably. I don't know who to talk to or what to believe. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was something I can't explain. But at the very least, I hope you found this story entertaining. In 2003, I met a guy who promised me adventure. He was charming and spontaneous, the opposite of my small-town upbringing. At the time, I had never traveled outside my state, let alone experienced much of life beyond the bubble of my quiet hometown. He told me he'd show me the world, and I, in my youthful naivety, believed him. What I didn't know was how much my safe little world was about to shatter. He was a truck driver, and soon after we started dating, he suggested I join him on the road. It sounded exciting, a chance to see the country and escape the monotony of my life. And at first, it was. I traveled across the U.S., saw incredible landscapes, and experienced places I'd only dreamed of. But life on the road was grueling. Imagine being stuck in a tiny cab with someone 24/7, with no personal space and minimal entertainment. Back then, we didn't have smartphones or streaming services. Our only distractions were a few DVDs, books, or conversations on the CB radio. The CB was our version of social media, a way to connect with other truckers. Everyone had a handle, a nickname to maintain anonymity. My ex went by Ninja Dwarf, and I became Northern Exposure because I was young and from Alaska. But not everyone on the CB was friendly. Some truckers were downright creepy, and one of them would eventually become a figure I'll never forget. One night, as we were driving through the middle of nowhere, the CB crackled to life. A faint voice broke through the static, growing louder as the truck got closer. Then I heard it clearly, and my blood ran cold. The voice was strange, off somehow. The closest comparison I can make is Heath Ledger's Joker, unsettling, with an edge of malice. "Hey there, Purple Pete, where you headed?" the voice asked, referencing the color of our truck. My ex answered casually, saying we were heading to Arkansas. "Mind if I tag along?" the man asked. He introduced himself as Maniac and described his truck, a black Peterbilt with a cattle guard and a brow. Over the weeks that followed, Maniac seemed to pop up everywhere we went. He claimed to run routes from California to Florida, which explained why we kept crossing paths. My ex started chatting with him regularly, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling his voice gave me. Then one week, Maniac suggested we meet in Nevada. My ex was excited about the idea, but I wasn't. Still, we agreed to meet at a truck stop, only for Maniac to stand us up. My ex brushed it off, but I felt relieved. Something about him just didn't sit right with me. Months later, we encountered him again, this time in Oklahoma. By then, there was buzz on the CB about a series of brutal murders targeting lot lizards, truck stop sex workers in the southern states. The stories were horrific. Women found mutilated and left in grotesque scenes. Most truckers dismissed it as radio gossip, but when my ex mentioned it to Maniac, his response was chilling. "Must be one sick fuck doing it," Maniac said with a laugh. "Bet he's leaving fingerprints everywhere, just begging to get caught." It was an odd thing to say, but Maniac was odd, so we didn't think much of it. Looking back, I wish I'd trusted my instincts. A few weeks later, we planned another meetup with Maniac, this time in Tennessee. When we arrived at the truck stop, he was nowhere to be found. We waited, ate dinner, and eventually headed back to our truck. As we walked through the lot, I noticed a bobtail truck parked oddly in a full space. It was dark, with a cattle guard and brow, and as we passed, I saw the driver sitting in the passenger seat under a red reading light. He looked at me and smiled. It was a smile I'll never forget. Creepy, distorted, and full of something sinister. He quickly shut the blinds, and chills ran up my spine. I didn't connect it to Maniac at the time, but the uneasy feeling stuck with me. Later that night, the CB chatter revealed the horrifying reason for the police presence at the truck stop. A lot lizard had been brutally murdered. I won't go into graphic details, but she'd been tied to a trailer and ripped apart when the unsuspecting driver pulled out. It was a scene straight out of a horror movie. I couldn't shake the image of her body or the smell of blood in the air. By the time we returned to our truck, the bobtail was gone. Months passed, and life on the road continued. By February 2004, we were in New Orleans. I was excited about the chance to explore the city and see the sights, but that excitement faded when Maniac's voice came over the CB again. "Hey there, Purple Pete! What brings you out this way?" he asked, his voice louder than ever. He was close. My ex, still bitter about the previous no-show, confronted him. "Why'd you stand us up in Tennessee?" Maniac laughed. "Cops make me uneasy. I'd rather not get caught." "Caught for what?" my ex asked, confused. Maniac's response made my blood run cold. "Don't worry about it. Just keep an eye on your girl. I'd hate for something bad to happen to her, like all those other girls." His voice grew darker as he continued, describing how he rid the world of its sins by torturing and killing lot lizards. Then, as if to drive the point home, his black Peterbilt rolled slowly past our truck. He keyed up the mic again, and his voice came through the CB one last time. "Be safe out there, Ninja Dwarf and Northern Exposure." I froze. It was the same truck and the same creepy grin I'd seen in Tennessee. After that encounter, I was done. I stopped making friends on the road and carried a knife with me everywhere we went. Maniac's words and that disgusting smile haunted me for years. By April, my ex and I had returned to Alaska for a family emergency. The trucking life felt like a distant nightmare, but I couldn't stop wondering how many victims Maniac had claimed. 7 murders had been tied to a trucker fitting his description, but who knows how long he'd been operating. I don't know if he was ever caught, but I can tell you one thing. I'm grateful I never met him alone. That voice, that smile, it's something I'll carry with me forever. It was more than creepy. It was pure evil. This happened about 13 years ago when I was a sophomore in college. I was attending a small liberal arts school in Suffolk County, New York, and by the end of my first couple of months as a freshman, I'd found my crew. We were a tight-knit group of theater geeks, 6 guys, including me, and 1 girl. We all loved horror movies, ghost stories, and just about anything creepy, so we were perfectly matched for the weird and the dramatic. Freshman year was rough, but having that group made everything easier and way more fun. Fast forward to sophomore year. October rolls around, Halloween vibes are in full swing, and we decide we're going to do something epic to celebrate. The plan? Find a spooky, isolated spot nearby, head out late at night, and scare ourselves senseless. After some internet sleuthing, we came across this area about 30 minutes away that was supposedly infamous for paranormal sightings. It sounded perfect. We split into 2 cars and set off into the night. The drive started off normal enough. Strip malls, fast food places, bright lights. But the second we turned off the main road, it was like a switch flipped. The area was pitch dark, thick with trees on either side, and the roads twisted and turned into an endless web. There were barely any streetlights or houses, and the deeper we went, the more it felt like we were leaving civilization behind. We had no real plan, other than to keep driving until we found a good spot to explore. Phones were fully charged, flashlights ready. We thought we were prepared for anything. Eventually, we came across a huge fallen log blocking the road, and that was our signal. This was as good a place as any to park and check things out. Past the log were 2 narrow trails leading in opposite directions, so we flipped a coin and picked the trail to the right. It was so narrow we had to walk single file to avoid the branches. Somehow, I ended up in the back, and that's when I started feeling off. I can't explain it fully, but I just had this creeping sense that we were being watched. I kept hearing faint noises coming from deep in the woods, like twigs snapping or leaves rustling. It wasn't loud enough for anyone else to notice, and I didn't want to sound paranoid, so I brushed it off. After all, we'd come out here to get scared, right? Besides, there were 7 of us, all able-bodied college students. What could possibly go wrong? We followed the trail for what felt like forever, about 20 minutes, when it suddenly opened up into a massive clearing. I mean, huge. The field stretched out like an overgrown golf course, surrounded by dense trees on every side. We couldn't even see where it ended. We were relieved to be out of the narrow trail, but none of us expected to find a space so vast in the middle of nowhere. Then someone spotted something. An old, boarded-up house on the far edge of the clearing. It was dark, with no signs of life. But of course, we had to check it out. We walked over, shining our flashlights at the windows and doors, but it was completely sealed up. Peeking through one of the gaps in the boards, I could see an old white couch covered in plastic in an otherwise empty room. Whoever had lived there was long gone. Since there was no way inside, we decided to head back toward the trail, plop down in the field, and figure out our next move. But just as we were about to sit, my friend Mark froze. His face dropped, and he pointed to the far side of the clearing. We all turned to look. There, on the edge of the field, was someone, tall, lanky, and pale, moving among the trees. They weren't walking, though. They were dancing, skipping, spinning, grabbing onto trees and swinging around them, like they were part of some bizarre performance. It was so surreal that at first, it didn't even register. The moonlight was bright, and it took a second for us to fully process what we were seeing. Our friend Jay, who's 6'4", and the eternal skeptic of the group, squinted at the figure and muttered, "What are you all looking at?" I pointed it out to him and said, "Right there. You don't see that?" The second he did, he gasped and clutched my arm. "What the hell is that?" And that's when it stopped dancing. It turned to face us, paused for just a moment, and then started sprinting straight toward us. We didn't wait to find out what it wanted. We bolted. I didn't even think. My legs just moved. Jay, who still hadn't fully processed what was happening, yelled after us, "What's going on? Where are you going?" But then I heard him scream, "Holy shit!" and saw his flashlight bouncing as he finally ran to catch up. What had taken us 20 minutes to walk now took closer to 5 to sprint. We made it back to the cars, jumped in, and tore out of there as fast as we could. We didn't stop until we were miles away. When we finally pulled over, we just sat there, trying to catch our breath and make sense of what had happened. My heart felt like it was going to explode. Nearly 15 years later, we're all still friends. Life has taken us to different places, but we still talk. And every now and then, one of us will bring it up in our group chat. The woods, that was real, right? And every time, we all confirm that yes, it absolutely was. Here's the part that sticks with me the most. Whoever or whatever that was, they were dancing alone in the woods in the dead of night. And when they saw us, a group of 7 people, they didn't hesitate to charge straight at us. It was like they weren't afraid of us at all. Had they been watching us from the moment we arrived? Were they the source of the noises I kept hearing on the trail? I'll never know. But one thing's for sure. None of us wanted to stick around to find out. This story took place about 11 years ago, during my senior year of high school. To this day, It remains the most unsettling and inexplicable event I have ever experienced. For context, it occurred in mid-December, during the frigid Iowa winter. If you are unfamiliar with winters in this region, they are brutal. Nighttime temperatures are life-threateningly cold, and the snow muffles everything, creating an eerie silence. Inside the house, every sound is amplified, and the stillness outside is palpable. That evening, my best friend Colton and I were spending a quiet night in my family's walkout basement. My mother was not home. She had gone to a bar with coworkers directly after work, so we had the house to ourselves. Given the circumstances, we decided to sneak into the family wine collection to add some excitement to an otherwise uneventful night. As we opened the first bottle, the sound of the garage door opening and slamming shut startled us. My immediate thought was, "Oh no," and I began frantically looking for a place to hide the wine bottle. Colton turned to me, confused, and said, "I thought you said your mom wasn't coming home tonight." "She's not supposed to be," I replied, equally confused. Then I heard a series of heavy footsteps, followed by my mother's voice calling out, "Meow Sanboo, anyone home?" This was her affectionate nickname for me. I yelled back, "Yes, just hanging out in the basement." The footsteps continued toward the stairs, and she called again, "Can you come help me with something? I need you up here." As I was still trying to conceal the wine bottle, I replied, "Sure, just give me a minute." And then, there was silence. For about 20 seconds, nothing moved. Then her voice came again, this time with a more serious tone. "Is anyone down there with you?" Something about her voice in that moment felt off. It sounded like my mother, but there was a subtle wrongness to it, something I couldn't quite place. It didn't help that our family never cared about who was visiting. Our home had always been an open and welcoming place. Feeling uneasy, I replied, "Just Colton." Finally satisfied with where I had stashed the bottle, I started up the stairs to see what she needed. Yet, as I climbed, I was overcome by an oppressive silence in the house. The air felt heavy, almost charged with something unnatural. When I reached the top of the stairs, I saw that the kitchen and the area near the garage door were completely dark. No lights were on, and no moonlight filtered in through the windows. The house was pitch black. I called out, "Mom, where are you?" But there was no response, just silence. At this point, that strange feeling of unease turned into full-blown dread. My heart raced, and adrenaline surged through me. I suddenly realized my mother wasn't home. I bolted back down the stairs, grabbing my coat as I went. "What's wrong?" Colton asked, seeing the panic on my face. "My mom's not home," I said, frantically searching for my truck keys. "What do you mean? You were just talking to her," he said, looking completely bewildered. "There's no one home. We need to leave. Now." But as I moved toward the door leading to the backyard, I noticed my dog trembling on the couch, and my cat growling from behind it. They were terrified, and the sight of them stopped me in my tracks. I couldn't just leave them there. Colton, still trying to process what was happening, asked, "So, are we going or not?" "No, I can't leave them here alone," I said, my voice shaking. "Something's really wrong. I'm calling my mom." I pulled out my phone and dialed her number. She answered almost immediately. "Meow Sanboo? What's going on?" "Mom," I said, my words tumbling out in a panic. "Were you just home? I heard you calling me from upstairs, but when I went up, you weren't there." Her response made my blood run cold. "No, I'm still at the bar. I wasn't feeling well, so I'm leaving now. Are you okay?" "What do you mean, you heard me?" I quickly explained everything, and she told me she was on her way home. Colton and I stayed in the basement with the animals until she arrived, but before she got there, we heard something upstairs. It wasn't footsteps or the sound of anything moving exactly. It was more like a heavy, oppressive presence, a pressure in the air, shifting from one room to the next. The only word that comes to mind to describe it is hungry. When my mom finally returned, the presence vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. The house felt lighter, as though whatever had been there was gone. To this day, we have no explanation for what happened. It's just one of many strange events that have occurred in that house. But this one stands out because I wasn't alone. Colton experienced it with me. Now, years later, my mother has passed away, and I've moved to Arizona. But every time I visit Iowa and see Colton, he still brings it up. He still shudders at the memory, as do I. Whatever it was that mimicked my mother's voice that night, it was not human. It was something else. Something dark. Something hungry. I'm a proud Floridian, born and raised. Back in the early 2000s, when this story took place, I was in college down in South Florida, but lived with my family up in the Florida Panhandle. That's about a 7-hour drive straight up through Central Florida, so I usually only made the trip home for holidays. It was Thanksgiving of my junior year, and I was pumped. I'd managed to rearrange my midterms so I could leave campus 3 days earlier than everyone else. My plan was simple: beat the holiday traffic and make it home in record time. My roommates and I had one last meal together in the dining hall around 4 p.m., and by 5:30, I was on the road. The trip was going smoothly. By 10 p.m., I was about 2/3 of the way home. That's when I hit my usual stop, a little mom-and-pop diner just off the highway. I always stopped there for a snack, a bathroom break, and to use the payphone to call my dad. No cell phone for me yet. But when I pulled in, I realized the place was out of business. It hadn't been that long since my last trip, but the lights were off, the windows boarded up, and my dreams of chocolate chip pancakes were officially crushed. Feeling a little bummed, I decided to keep going. The area wasn't exactly bustling. There weren't a lot of other places to stop, but eventually, I saw a sign for a rest stop in a little town called Alachua. I think that's how it's spelled. I figured it would do. When I pulled into the rest stop, I parked directly under a streetlight. You know, for safety. I used the facilities, stretched my legs, and called my dad to let him know everything was fine. The place was mostly deserted, except for this one exhausted-looking woman who came up to me as I was heading back to my car. She said she was traveling with her husband and 2 young kids, trying to get to Disney, but had made a wrong turn somewhere. She asked me for directions, and I did my best to help her out before heading back to my car. That's when I noticed it. Parked this close to the driver's side of my '95 Honda Civic was a beat-up, unmarked van. It was gray or maybe bluish. It was hard to tell under the streetlights, and it looked like the kind of work van you see in movies when something bad is about to happen. My first thought? That's weird. It had Florida plates, so it definitely wasn't the woman's van. She said she was from Virginia. The whole thing felt off. My gut was telling me something wasn't right. I turned right around and hightailed it back toward the rest stop. where I almost ran into this middle-aged guy with two little boys. As I was catching my breath, the woman I'd spoken to earlier emerged from the bathroom. It turned out they were a family traveling together. Something about their presence made me feel safe enough to explain what was going on with the van. I told the guy everything. How it was parked way too close to my car, how it didn't belong to the woman, and how I had no idea what to do. He listened, glanced over at the van, and said, "All right, I'll go check it out." Before heading over, he left the kids with his wife and strutted confidently toward the van. I could see him approach the driver's side and stand there for a moment, hesitating. Then, his voice cracked as he yelled, loud enough for us to hear from about 100 feet away. "Excuse me, gentlemen. We already called the police, so I'm going to have to politely suggest that you get out of here." And then, he bolted. He sprinted back to us, grabbed his wife and kids, pointed at me, and barked, "You! Let's go! Now! Get in the car!" I didn't argue. The next thing I knew, I was crammed into the back of their SUV, completely confused, as he ran to the payphone to actually call the police. Meanwhile, the van peeled out like nothing I've ever seen. These guys couldn't get out of there fast enough. They drove up on the curb, tires screeching, burning rubber. Honestly, it would have been funny if it weren't so terrifying. When the cops arrived, we all explained what happened, and that's when I got the full picture. The man said he could see into the van pretty clearly because I had parked under the streetlight. All the seats except the driver's seat had been removed. There was a guy sitting in the driver's seat and another guy sitting in the back. The floor was covered by a tarp, and there was a bunch of random stuff in there, things he couldn't immediately identify. And the creepiest part? They weren't doing anything normal, like reading a map or even pretending to fiddle with something. They were just sitting there, watching, waiting. The whole thing still makes me sick to think about. I don't even want to imagine what could have happened if I'd gone straight to my car that night, instead of turning back. This happened about 6 or 7 years ago. Back then, I played soccer for 1 year at my community college after high school. That's how I met this guy. He worked for the athletics department. He was another student, and at first, he seemed pretty normal. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, I had this 1-hour gap between classes, so I usually hung out in the library to study or kill time. One day, he noticed me there and asked what I was doing. I told him about my gap, and after that, he started showing up regularly to hang out during that hour. At first, I didn't mind. He seemed like an okay guy, and it wasn't like I had much else to do. But looking back, there were little things that were off. For one, he didn't have a reason to be there. He wasn't waiting for a class or studying. He was just hanging out, and it started to feel like he was showing up specifically for me. Then, there were the gifts. Every now and then, he'd bring me something small, like chocolate or candy. I thought it was sweet, but a little odd, considering I barely knew him. He always downplayed it, though. Like, they had extra Kit Kat bars in the office. Do you want one? He never said he went out and bought it for me. But now that I look back, I think that's exactly what he was doing. It's like he knew outright gift-giving might be too much and wanted to make it seem casual. The soccer season ended before Thanksgiving, and only the playoff teams kept playing after that, not us. After Thanksgiving, it was finals season, so things were pretty hectic. During that short period between soccer ending and Thanksgiving break, he started asking about my schedule for the next semester. Honestly, I hadn't figured it out yet. I wasn't super organized with course registration, and the counselors at my school were no help. I didn't tell him all that, but I did mention I didn't want to have another hour-long gap in my schedule, because it felt like such a waste of time. He didn't seem happy to hear that. I didn't think much of it in the moment, but now I wonder why it bothered him so much. He also asked me if I was planning to play another soccer season, and I told him no. I needed to manage my time better, and soccer just wasn't helping. It was fun, but playing every day took too much of my focus, and I had other priorities. Looking back, I think my mistake was oversharing. Just saying too much without thinking about how it might land with him. I had a bad habit of being unfiltered like that back then, not realizing how my words could affect other people. That was the last Thursday before Thanksgiving. After that, there were no more hour-long gaps to hang out. We went on Thanksgiving break, took our finals, and then had winter break. For a little while, everything was fine. Life felt normal again. Then winter break rolled around, and that's when things started to get bad. It began with him showing up outside my house, sitting in his car in the mornings. The first time, I couldn't believe it. I told myself it had to be a coincidence. But the second time, I checked more carefully, and it was him. There was no mistaking it. At that point, it was clear to both of us what was going on. He was stalking me, and it didn't stop there. I used to post on Instagram stories, just casual stuff about where I was or what I was doing. Somehow, he started showing up at those places. Stores at the mall, coffee shops, wherever. I'd post about being at a girly store he'd have zero reason to be in, and then he'd show up. It got to the point where he started pointing his phone at me, like he was taking pictures. That part was even creepier. I stopped using social media after that. I couldn't deal with the thought of him tracking me anymore. But even without social media, the stalking continued. After winter break, he started coming by during the afternoons too, especially when my parents were at work. I called the cops a few times, but nothing ever came of it. He didn't trespass, didn't make threats, didn't have a weapon, nothing that would technically get him in trouble. He was careful, just staying barely within the boundaries of the law. The cops tried talking to him, but he refused to engage. He knew exactly what he was doing. I don't know what he's doing now. My guess is that he eventually got bored or found someone else to fixate on. At least, that's what I hope. But honestly, if he still drives by, I have no idea. I try not to think about it. The hardest part, I couldn't tell my parents. I knew they'd freak out, and I didn't want them to carry that worry. So I dealt with it on my own, and that made it all the more exhausting. Last Thanksgiving, my friend and I, we were both 21 at the time, were driving home from college. I live in a really isolated part of Arkansas, and to get there, you have to drive through an hour of mountain roads filled with hairpin turns. There are blind corners everywhere, and the entire time you're basically on the edge of these massive drop-offs. No barriers, no safety net. Normally, I'm pretty confident driving through the mountains, but this time, we were in my friend's car, so I was being extra cautious. Still, I was going about 5 miles over the speed limit. Not long after we hit the roughest stretch of the drive, another car came up behind us and started tailgating. And I mean really close. It was stressing me out, and as soon as I found a spot where I could pull over, I did. It was a church parking lot. My friend offered to take over driving, but I said no. It was pitch black outside, and she'd never driven this route before. I didn't want to risk it. We got back on the road, but just a few minutes later, I had to slam on the brakes. Out of nowhere, There was a car stopped in the middle of the road. Not on the shoulder or anything, right in the middle. Dead still. My friend thought maybe they'd broken down and couldn't call for a tow since there's no cell service in that area. But the whole situation gave me a bad feeling. I locked the doors right away and told her to stay in the car no matter what. That's when she pointed out something I hadn't even considered. I think that's the same car that was tailgating us. I couldn't tell for sure, but my stomach dropped. If it was the same car, this wasn't some random breakdown. The road was so narrow, and the car was parked just before a sharp hairpin turn, so there was no way to safely pass it. My friend kept telling me to just go around, but I was terrified. What if another car came flying around the corner? What if we slid off the edge of the mountain? I honked the horn. Nothing. No one got out of the car, and it didn't move an inch. We couldn't call for help. There was no cell service, and we were completely alone on that road. The fear was starting to creep in. Something about this didn't feel right at all. We just sat there, waiting. I didn't know what else to do. My friend was crying, freaking out, begging me to do something, but I was too scared to try passing him. The mountain road was too dangerous, and the whole situation felt so wrong. I honked a few more times, hoping he'd move, but instead, the driver got out of his car. He walked around to the back of his car and leaned against it, just staring at us. He didn't check his car or anything, just stood there, casually, like he had all the time in the world. My friend was losing it by now, full on sobbing, but I told her not to look at him. Don't make eye contact. I was frozen, gripping the steering wheel so hard my hands hurt. I was ready to slam on the gas if he did anything, but he didn't. He just stood there, staring at us. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, praying another car would come along. Any car. Anything to break this standoff. It felt like forever, but it was probably 15 minutes or so. The whole time he didn't say a word, didn't move, just leaned there, watching us. Then finally, I saw headlights coming up behind us in the mirror. The moment he saw the lights, he turned, jogged to his car, and got back in. Without hesitation, he sped off, flying down the road like a maniac. There was nothing wrong with his car. I waited for the other car to pass, then started driving again, carefully but quickly. I just wanted to get out of there, but I didn't want to cause an accident either. My friend was still shaken, and honestly, so was I. For a while, the road was quiet again, and I thought maybe we'd seen the last of him. But then, we passed his car. It was parked on the shoulder, waiting. As soon as we passed, he pulled back onto the road and started tailing us. Again. This time, I tried speeding up, hoping to lose him. But no matter how fast I went, he stayed right behind us. By now, we had cell service, but I wasn't sure if calling the cops was the right move. What would I even say? Nothing had really happened yet. So instead, I called home. I told my brothers what was going on and asked them to wait for us on the porch. They said they'd be there, and knowing they'd be ready made me feel a little safer. But the guy kept following us, all the way home, even down our long gravel driveway. When we pulled up, my two brothers were waiting on the porch, both holding their deer rifles. As soon as the guy saw them, he stopped at the end of the driveway, turned around, and sped off back the way he'd come. We tried to catch his license plate, but it was too dark, and we couldn't make it out. My friend and I were shaken, to say the least. But later, When I told some other friends about what happened, they just shrugged it off, like it wasn't a big deal. Even now, I can't stop thinking about how it could have gone differently. What if my brothers hadn't been there? What if we'd tried passing him on that mountain road? It's one of those things that feels small when you tell it, but in the moment, it felt life or death. This happened a couple of years ago, and honestly, I still get chills every time I think about it. It was one of those moments where everything seems fine, and then suddenly, it's like you've stepped into a horror movie. I was driving back home late at night from my parents' house in southern Germany. It's a pretty rural area, so the roads were quiet. Almost too quiet. I was tired, but in a good mood, thinking about getting home and crawling into bed. Then, out of nowhere, my headlights caught something in the middle of the road. It was a log. A big one, too, completely blocking the road. I stopped the car, frustrated. This was the only road that could get me home without adding an extra hour to my drive. The thought of turning around and finding another way was almost worse than dealing with the stupid log, so I decided to get out and move it myself. Now, Germany isn't exactly known for dangerous wildlife or anything crazy in rural areas. The worst you might encounter is a deer or a hedgehog. So I wasn't worried about animals or anything like that. It was just me, the quiet night, and my car idling behind me. The log didn't look too bad, but once I started pushing it, I realized it was heavier than I thought. The ground was uneven, and it took me a lot longer than I expected. By the time I finally got it out of the way, I noticed a car had pulled up behind me. It was just sitting there, its headlights beaming into my rearview mirror. At first, I didn't think much of it. I figured it was another driver waiting for me to finish so they could get through. That kind of thing happens all the time on these narrow, rural roads. I got back into my car and started driving, expecting them to do the same. But they didn't just follow me down the road. They stayed right behind me. At first, I told myself it was a coincidence. I mean, where else were they supposed to go? It's not like there were a lot of options. But then, as we got closer to the next town, they didn't turn off. They didn't take a single different road. Every time I looked in my mirror, their headlights were still there. That's when I started to panic. I called the police, trying to keep my voice calm as I explained what was happening. I told them the car had been following me for a while now, and that I was on my way home. They said they'd send officers to meet me there, but I wasn't comfortable leading this guy straight to my house. I couldn't bear the thought of him knowing where I lived. So, I parked a few houses away, still on the phone with the dispatcher. I locked my doors, grabbed my pepper spray from my bag, and waited. My heart was racing. I kept telling myself it was probably nothing, just some driver who happened to be going the same way. But when I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw the car pull up right behind me, and then the driver got out. I clutched the pepper spray so tightly my hand hurt. The man was walking toward my car, waving his arms a little and gesturing like he wanted to talk to me. My first instinct was to just drive away, but something about him seemed off. He didn't look threatening, exactly. He looked more urgent, like he was trying to tell me something. I cracked the window just enough to hear him. My voice was shaky when I asked, "What do you want?" He stopped a couple of feet from my car and raised his hands, trying to show he wasn't a threat. Then he said, "Listen, I've been following you because while you were moving that log, I saw someone climb into the trunk of your car." I froze. "What?" I asked, not even sure I'd heard him right. "I saw it happen," he said. "A man. He climbed into your trunk, and he's probably still there." At first, I didn't believe him. Who says something like that? It sounded insane. I thought maybe he was trying to trick me into getting out of the car. But then he held up his phone and showed me that he'd already called the police. He even let me hear the dispatcher on the line, confirming the story. That's when it hit me. He was serious. I was shaking as I climbed out of the car, keeping my pepper spray ready just in case. The man stayed a few feet away, hands up, clearly trying not to scare me any more than I already was. Just as he promised, the police arrived a few minutes later. When they opened the trunk, there he was. A man curled up, hiding in the back of my car. The police arrested him on the spot. They didn't give me too many details about who he was, but from what I overheard, he wasn't just some random guy. He had bad intentions, and I couldn't stop thinking about what might have happened if I'd driven all the way home with him still in there. The man who followed me turned out to be a complete lifesaver. If he hadn't been paying attention or decided to warn me, who knows how that night would have ended. Ever since then, I double-check my car every single time I get in. Doors, windows, trunk, everything. And if you're like I was, driving around without locking your doors, trust me, don't. It's not worth the risk. I used to work at this little pizzeria just a few blocks from my house. It was close enough that I could walk there and back, which was super convenient. I'd always liked that part of the job, the short commute, the fresh air, and the quiet after a busy shift. Working there, I met all kinds of people. Some were sweet and friendly. Others were entitled and impatient, and most fell somewhere in between. But there was this one guy. I'll never forget him. Even thinking about him now gives me chills. He wasn't a regular, thank God, but he came in just often enough to stick in my memory. Every time he walked through the door, I'd feel my stomach twist. It wasn't anything obvious, at least not at first glance. He always had this huge smile plastered across his face, but it didn't feel real. It was too wide, too forced, like he was trying to convince you he was harmless. And then there was the way he'd grab your arm when he talked to you, leaning in way too close, telling you how much he loved the food. I tried to brush it off as him just being overly friendly, but something about him always made me uncomfortable. I'd cringe every time I saw him walk in. Still, he didn't come in that often, so I never thought much about it beyond the brief moments he was there. One night, though, everything changed. It was a closing shift, and I was working alone. The last customer in the dining room was, you guessed it, him. The front sign was turned off, the ovens were shut down, and I'd already locked the side doors. I was washing dishes in the back, waiting for him to leave, and when I didn't hear the loud bathroom door creak open, I figured he must have slipped out while I was cleaning. I went to check the dining room, and sure enough, it was empty. Relieved, I headed to the front to lock the doors. Everything seemed fine. Just another quiet night. But when I turned to go back into the kitchen, there he was. He was standing dead in the middle of the kitchen, holding his dirty dishes out like a peace offering. "Were you looking for these?" he asked, his voice too cheerful, that creepy grin still plastered across his face. "I thought you might want them." My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't heard him come in. How long had he been standing there? Trying not to let my unease show, I forced a laugh. "You startled me. I thought you'd left already," I said, walking up to take the dishes from him. "Let me unlock the door for you so you can head out." As I reached for the plates, his hand shot out and grabbed my arm. Not hard, but firmly enough to make me freeze. He leaned in, staring into my eyes with that awful fake smile. "I just wanted to say how grateful I am," he said, his grip tightening slightly. "You're always so helpful, and I really appreciate your service." My skin crawled. I managed a weak smile, muttered something like, "No problem," and set the dishes aside. I led him to the door, crouching to unlock the lower bolt. As I did, I felt his hand touch the top of my head. My breath caught. Slowly, I looked up, and there he was, staring down at me with that same grin. "You're such a good worker," he said softly. "I'll definitely be back." I slammed the door shut as soon as he stepped outside, locking it with shaking hands. My heart was racing, and I couldn't shake the feeling of his hand on my head. I finished up as quickly as I could and bolted out the side exit, hoping to avoid any chance of running into him again. But the nightmare wasn't over. As I stepped outside, I noticed a car parked out front with someone sitting inside. It was him. He was just sitting there, watching the store. My stomach dropped. I ducked down and slipped into the shadows, hoping he hadn't seen me, and hurried home as fast as I could. The next night, it happened again. He was parked down the street, closer to the side entrance this time. When I walked out, he waved at me, that same eerie smile on his face. I didn't wave back. I just kept walking, my heart pounding. The night after that, he parked even closer, this time near my house. When I saw him, I nearly froze. I didn't know what to do. I kept my head down and walked quickly, pretending I hadn't noticed him. By the fourth night, he wasn't in his car anymore. Instead, he was walking down the street, toward me. That's when I panicked. I turned down a side road and ran, not stopping until I was inside my house with the doors locked. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next 2 days, I went out of my way to take different routes home, zigzagging through the neighborhood to throw him off. But on the third day, he was there again. This time, he wasn't parked in one spot. He kept circling around, passing me multiple times, watching me to see which direction I was going. That was the last straw. I told my cousin everything, and they immediately started giving me rides home. I couldn't keep doing this alone. We even agreed to keep an eye out for him, so we could report him if he showed up again. A few days later, I was back at work during a busy shift. I thought I was safe, but then I turned around and saw him standing in the kitchen doorway. "Where have you been?" he asked, his voice overly casual, but with an edge that sent chills down my spine. "I haven't seen you much lately." He made it sound like he'd been coming in regularly, looking for me. My coworker was nearby, so I tried to keep things light, making small talk until he left. As soon as he was gone, I told her everything, about the stalking, the car, the nights he followed me. She was shocked, but immediately reassured me. "If he comes back," she said firmly, "I'll handle it." The strange thing is, he never came back after that. Not to the pizzeria, not on the streets, not anywhere. It was like he just disappeared. For weeks, I was paranoid, expecting to see his car parked outside or his face in the doorway. But he was gone. I still don't know what his deal was, what he wanted, or why he suddenly vanished. All I know is that those nights left a mark on me. To this day, I double-check the locks every time I close up, and I can't walk home at night without feeling like someone's watching me. 4 years ago, when I was 20, I had the most terrifying experience of my life. It was during a tattoo convention in Toronto. Back then, I was just an apprentice, super excited for my first ever convention, but completely underprepared for what the whole thing entailed. There were 6 of us going from the studio I worked at. 3 guys and 3 of us girls. The guys had been smart and booked their hotel room early. Us? Not so much. I didn't realize until the last minute that rooms near the convention center would be booked solid. I panicked for a bit, frantically searching for something affordable nearby. Finally, I found a crappy Super 8 in Chinatown with 1 room left. It wasn't ideal. It was literally inside an Asian strip mall and looked a bit sketchy, but the other girls didn't mind. We weren't planning to hang out at the hotel much anyway, so I booked it. When we arrived, the place was exactly as bad as I expected. The entrance was tucked away in the mall, and the whole vibe screamed low budget. But we shrugged it off. We checked in, unpacked our stuff, and then headed to the convention center to set up our supplies. That part was amazing, being surrounded by so many talented artists and feeling like I was part of this huge creative community. After setting up, a bunch of other tattoo artists invited us all out for drinks. Of course, we said yes. It was my first convention, and I didn't want to miss a chance to hang out and get to know everyone. We went to this bar, and the night was a blast. Everyone was having a great time, but I'm not much of a drinker, so I started to feel it pretty quickly. It got later and later, and I knew I needed to call it a night if I wanted to be functional the next day. I asked if anyone wanted to head back with me, but they were all still in party mode. I didn't want to ruin their fun, so I told them I'd grab an Uber and head back alone. I figured it wasn't a big deal. It was just a short ride to the hotel. When I got there, the place was deserted. The mall was dark and silent, not a soul in sight. The hotel entrance was the same. I walked past the front desk, and there was no one there, not even a night clerk. It was a little creepy, but I told myself to chill out. It was late, and I was probably just overthinking things. I took the elevator to my floor and started walking toward my room. On the way, I passed the communal breakfast area, which was dark, but as I glanced inside, I saw a man sitting there. He was alone, just sitting in the shadows. As soon as he noticed me, he stood up. I could hear his footsteps behind me as I continued walking. My stomach sank. I told myself it was nothing, that he was probably just heading to his own room. But something felt off. I decided to turn around, just to check. That's when I saw it. The most disgusting, heart-stopping thing I've ever experienced. The hallway had these little recessed doorways where the room doors were set back slightly. As I turned around, I saw him quickly dip into one of those doorways, hiding. Then, he leaned out just enough to peek at me from behind the wall. We made eye contact, and I swear, my heart dropped into my stomach. I spun back around and started walking faster, trying to stay calm, but I could feel my pulse racing. I just wanted to get to my room and lock the door, but I couldn't resist checking again. At the end of the hallway, there was a fire extinguisher behind a glass panel, and when I glanced at the reflection, I saw him behind me again. He was following me, close enough that I could hear his footsteps now. When I turned around this time, he did the same thing, dipping into another doorway and peeking out at me. It was like something out of a horror movie. My hands were shaking, and I felt this cold wave of panic wash over me. I knew I couldn't let him see which room was mine. I was almost there, just a few steps away. As soon as I reached my door, I swiped my key card so fast I'm surprised I didn't drop it. I slipped inside, slammed the door shut, and locked it in a heartbeat. My hands were trembling as I flipped the deadbolt and chained the door for extra security. Thank God the hallway turned a corner near my room. He hadn't seen which door I went into. I pressed my eye to the peephole, holding my breath, and watched as he paced up and down the hallway for what felt like an eternity. He kept glancing around, like he was trying to figure out where I'd gone. Finally, after a few minutes, he walked away. I didn't feel safe, though. I grabbed the phone in the room and tried calling the front desk, hoping to reach security, but no one answered. Not even after several tries. My stomach sank. There was no one there. I had no backup. I called my coworkers, still at the bar, and told them everything. They didn't even hesitate. They rushed back to the hotel to help me. When they arrived, we finally found an employee. Apparently, the hotel didn't have any overnight security, and the staff was minimal at best. They tried to look for the guy, but he was long gone by then. The employee said they'd check the cameras, but I never heard anything more about it. I spent the rest of the night in my room with the door bolted shut, every noise in the hallway making my heart race. I barely slept. I still don't know what that guy wanted, or what would have happened if he'd caught me. All I know is that I'm glad I ran. Even now, years later, I can't walk down a quiet hotel hallway without feeling that same creeping dread. A few years ago, I had one of the creepiest experiences of my life, and it all started with a new coworker. At the time, I worked in a small factory. There were only a handful of employees, and we all mostly kept to ourselves. It was a quiet place, simple work, nothing too exciting. But everything changed when my boss hired this older guy to work on the other side of the factory. The factory was split into two areas, one for beeswax production and one for wood. This new guy, let's call him Steve, was brought in because he and my boss went to the same church. Apparently, the wood production had some sort of religious significance, and my boss thought Steve was the perfect fit for the job. At first, I didn't think much of him. He worked on the wood side, and I rarely saw him. A few weeks after he started, though, he came over to my side of the factory to introduce himself. He seemed fine, polite, even friendly. I didn't think twice about it. Later that day, he came back and handed me a Hershey's Kiss. It was a little random, but I just assumed he was trying to be nice. For a while, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. He stayed on his side of the factory, and I stayed on mine. Then one day, my boss asked me if I could give Steve a ride to work. Apparently, his car was out of commission, and since I lived nearby, it made sense. My boss asked if he could give Steve my number so we could coordinate. I didn't see a problem with it, so I said yes. The first ride went fine. I picked him up, made some small talk, and dropped him off at work. But soon after that, texts started. At first, the messages seemed harmless. He'd text me at random times, usually late at night, asking if I wanted to hang out or apologizing for being older and bothering me. I thought it was weird, but I figured he was just lonely. I tried to be polite, but kept my responses short, hoping he'd get the hint. He didn't. The texts started getting longer, like absurdly long. They were full of typos, random ramblings, and really inappropriate stuff. He'd write these weird, pervy messages that were uncomfortable to read, let alone respond to. I started ignoring them, but that only seemed to make things worse. The texts became more frequent, more desperate, and more graphic. Then things got even creepier. One day, my roommates wanted to go to a casino nearby, but they needed a ride. I couldn't take them, so I gave them a few bucks and told them to figure it out. A couple of hours later, they came back. And guess who gave them a ride? Steve. I froze when I saw him pull up in the driveway. Not only did he now know where I lived, but I had no idea how he'd even ended up giving my roommates a ride in the first place. Was it just a weird coincidence? Or had he somehow orchestrated this to find out where I lived? Either way, I was freaked out. A few days later, I went to visit a friend who lived in an apartment above some shops downtown. When I left, I was walking along the sidewalk, minding my own business, when I caught something out of the corner of my eye. I turned, and there he was. Steve. Standing in the doorway of one of the shops, wearing a black top hat of all things, and grinning at me. That grin, it sent chills down my spine. I rushed to my car, trying to shake the image of him just standing there watching me. Unfortunately, that wasn't the last time I saw him. A couple of weeks later, I was leaving my friend's apartment again when I spotted him on the sidewalk, just standing there with that same unsettling grin. My stomach dropped. I texted my friend, letting him know Steve was back. He came downstairs to check, but by the time he got to the sidewalk, Steve was gone. Meanwhile, the texts kept coming. They got more graphic, more persistent, and more threatening. He started saying things like, "If you don't respond, I'll come by your house." The messages would describe in disgusting detail what he wanted to do if he showed up. At work, though, he acted like everything was normal. He'd say hi in passing, make small talk, and go about his day as if he wasn't bombarding me with inappropriate texts at night. It was maddening. I didn't know what to do. I was scared, but I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. Then, one day, I overheard a couple of coworkers talking about how weird Steve was. That's when I decided to speak up. I pulled one of them aside, someone I'd worked with for years, and showed him the messages. He was shocked. I told him not to say anything to our boss, but apparently, he couldn't keep quiet. The next morning, my boss called me into his office. He said he'd been told about the situation and asked to see the texts. I hesitated, not wanting to get anyone in trouble, but my boss insisted. "This isn't about getting someone in trouble," he said. "This is about making sure you're safe." Reluctantly, I handed over my phone. My boss read through the messages, and his face went from calm to furious. He said there was no excuse for Steve's behavior, and that it would be dealt with immediately. The next day, Steve was still there, but he avoided me completely. No more grins, no more small talk, and thank God, no more texts. After that, he seemed to disappear. I don't know what my boss said to him, but whatever it was, It worked. The creepy behavior stopped completely. The weirdest part? That situation ended up changing my life in a way I never expected. The coworker I'd confided in, the one who told my boss, started talking to me more. He'd always seemed kind of grumpy and distant, but after all that, we became close. A few years later, we got married. So, to Steve, wherever you are now, let's never meet again. Because if you do show up, I know my husband will have a lot to say about it. Last year, I was driving back home after a solo road trip. I'd spent a few days exploring small towns and stopping at roadside diners, just trying to clear my head. The last day was a long stretch of highway through mostly empty countryside. It was one of those roads where you don't see another car for miles, and the scenery is just endless fields and the occasional cluster of trees. It was late afternoon when I noticed the van. It was an older, white van with no windows in the back. I didn't think much of it at first. It passed me on the left and then slowed down, hovering a little in front of me for a few minutes before pulling ahead. Weird, but not alarming. People drive like that sometimes, right? I figured that was the last I'd see of it, but about 20 minutes later, I noticed it again. It was parked on the shoulder, maybe 100 yards ahead, with its hazard lights blinking. As I passed, I saw the driver standing outside, looking like he was checking the tires or something. He didn't wave for help, didn't even look at me, just stood there. I kept driving. Another hour passed, and I'd almost forgotten about the van. The sun was starting to set, and I was trying to focus on finding a decent spot to stop for the night. That's when I noticed headlights coming up fast behind me. The same van. It sped up and passed me again, only to slow down once it was a few car lengths ahead. It felt deliberate this time, like they were waiting for me to catch up. My stomach started to knot. I eased off the gas, trying to put some distance between us, but they matched my speed. Now, I was on edge. This wasn't random. I took the next exit, which led to a small town. The van kept going straight, and I let out a breath of relief. Maybe I was just being paranoid. I pulled into a gas station to refuel and stretch my legs. It was one of those tiny, run-down places with a single pump and a flickering light over the side. As I was finishing up, I saw it. The white van, turning into the gas station lot. My heart dropped. I got back in my car and locked the doors, trying not to look panicked. The van pulled up to the other side of the lot, and the driver just sat there. He didn't get out, didn't go to the pump. He was just watching. I told myself to stay calm. I started my car and pulled back onto the highway, keeping an eye on the rearview mirror. Sure enough, the van pulled out behind me. Now I was scared. It wasn't just coincidence anymore. This guy was following me. I kept driving, trying to come up with a plan. I didn't want to stop again, but I couldn't drive forever. I sped up, hoping to lose him, but the van sped up too. No matter how fast I went, he stayed right on my tail. Then he started flashing his high beams. At first, I thought maybe he was trying to signal me that something was wrong with my car, but I knew better. This wasn't a friendly warning. This was intimidation. He flashed the lights on and off, again and again, and then started honking. My hands were shaking. I gripped the wheel tighter, trying to think of what to do. There were no other cars, no exits, no signs of life. Just me and this guy in the van. Finally, I saw a sign for a rest area a mile ahead. I didn't want to stop, but I figured it was better than staying alone on the road. Maybe someone would be there, or at least I could get into a public space. I pulled into the rest area, my heart racing. It was mostly empty, just a couple of cars parked near the bathrooms and a trucker asleep in his rig. I parked close to the other cars, hoping for safety in numbers. The van pulled in right behind me. The driver didn't park, though. He just stopped in the middle of the lot, his headlights glaring into my car. The engine was still running, and I could see his silhouette behind the wheel. He wasn't getting out, but he wasn't leaving either. I grabbed my phone and called 911. My voice was shaking as I told the operator what was happening. She told me to stay in the car, keep the doors locked, and wait for the police. She stayed on the line with me, asking for details about the van and the driver, but I couldn't see much through the glare of the headlights. Minutes felt like hours. The van just sat there, engine idling, headlights burning into my windshield. I could feel my chest tightening, panic setting in. Then, out of nowhere, the van's lights went off. The engine revved, and it sped out of the lot. I didn't move. I stayed on the line with the operator until the police arrived about 10 minutes later. They took my statement and promised to patrol the area, but there wasn't much they could do without a license plate or clear description of the driver. I ended up following the police to the next town and checking into a motel. I didn't sleep much that night, and I left before dawn, taking a completely different route home. To this day, I don't know who was in that van or what they wanted. But I can't shake the feeling that if I hadn't gone to that rest area, or if the police hadn't shown up in time, it could have ended very differently. Now, every time I go on a road trip, I'm hyper aware of every car around me. So, last summer, my buddy Ryan and I decided to go on a road trip. Nothing crazy, just a couple of guys hitting the road for a few days to get away from work and all the stress. We didn't have a set plan. Just drive, crash at motels, see some sights, and enjoy the freedom. You know, typical road trip vibes. The first couple of days were awesome. We hit some small diners, took a ton of dumb photos with roadside attractions, and just soaked it all in. It felt like one of those trips you'd remember forever. But then, things got weird. It was our second night, and we were driving down this long, empty stretch of road somewhere out in the middle of nowhere. The GPS had rerouted us because of some construction, so we were on this back road. 2 lanes, no lights, and no other cars. Just us, the trees, and the occasional house way off in the distance. It was getting late, close to midnight, when we saw someone on the side of the road. A guy. He was just standing there, holding out his thumb. Ryan slowed down immediately. "Should we stop?" No, I said. "It's creepy. Let's keep going." "What if he needs help?" Ryan said, glancing at me. I shook my head. "There's no way this ends well. Just keep driving." So, Ryan sped up, and as we passed him, I glanced out the window. The guy was tall, wearing a dark jacket and jeans with a backpack over one shoulder. But what got me was his face. He was staring right at me, like not at the car, but directly at me. It wasn't an angry look, but it wasn't normal either. It was blank, like he was studying me or something. It gave me chills. I turned back to Ryan. "That was weird, right?" Ryan shrugged. "He probably just needs a ride." "Yeah, well, He's not getting one from us, I said, trying to laugh it off. But honestly, I couldn't stop thinking about it. About 10 minutes later, we saw a gas station. It was the only thing we'd come across for miles, so we decided to stop, grab some snacks, and stretch our legs. The place was old and run down, with one flickering light over the pumps, and a tiny convenience store that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 90s. While we were inside grabbing chips and drinks, I happened to glance out the window. And guess who I saw? The hitchhiker. He was standing across the street, under a streetlight, just staring. Not moving, not trying to cross the road, just standing there, looking straight at the gas station. "Ryan," I said, nudging him. "That guy's here." Ryan came over and looked. "No way. How did he get here so fast?" That's the thing. It didn't make sense. We hadn't seen any cars pass us, and there was no way he could have walked that distance in the time it took us to get there. My stomach was in knots. The guy behind the counter noticed us staring and asked, "Everything okay?" "There's a guy out there," I said. "We saw him hitchhiking earlier, and now he's just standing there." The cashier walked over, looked out the window, and then turned back to us. "There's no one out there." I looked again, and the hitchhiker was gone. We paid for our stuff and got back in the car, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Ryan tried to brush it off, saying maybe it was just a coincidence or we were imagining things, but I could tell he was freaked out too. We decided to just keep driving until we found a motel. About an hour later, we finally saw one of those cheap motels on the side of the road, the kind with a big neon sign that buzzes and flickers. We pulled in, checked in with the night clerk, and got a room. It wasn't great. Old carpet, saggy beds, and a weird smell. But at that point, we didn't care. We were exhausted. I crashed pretty hard, but around 3 a.m., I woke up to this weird tapping sound. It wasn't loud, just faint, like someone tapping on the window. I froze for a second, trying to convince myself it was just the wind or something. But then it happened again. Tap, tap, tap. "Ryan," I whispered, trying to wake him up, but he just groaned and rolled over. I got up slowly and walked over to the window. The blinds were drawn, but the tapping was definitely coming from the other side. My heart was racing, but I reached out and pulled the blinds back. No one was there. But then I noticed something. On the glass, in the condensation, was a single handprint. Large, smudged, and fresh. I stepped back, my chest tightening. I didn't even bother trying to wake Ryan again. I just sat on the bed, staring at the window until the sun came up. As soon as it was light, I shook Ryan awake and said, "We need to leave. Now." He didn't argue. We packed up, skipped the free breakfast, and hit the road. Neither of us said much for the next few hours, but I could tell we were both on edge. To this day, I have no idea what happened. Was the guy following us? Did he even know we were the same car that passed him? I don't know. But every time I drive down a quiet road at night, I can't help but look out for hitchhikers. And I never, ever stop. This happened a few months ago. I was driving home from a weekend visiting some friends who live a few hours away. It was late, probably around 10 p.m., and the highway was pretty empty. Just me, the dark road, and a couple of cars that came and went. Nothing unusual. About an hour into the drive, I noticed a pair of headlights in my rearview mirror. They weren't too close, but they were steady, staying behind me no matter how fast or slow I went. At first, I didn't think much of it. It's a highway. People go the same way all the time. But after another 15 minutes of them following at the same distance, I started feeling weird about it. I changed lanes to see if they'd pass me, but they changed lanes too. Still not right behind me, but definitely following. I sped up a little just to test the waters. They sped up too. At this point, I was officially freaked out. I tried telling myself I was just being paranoid. Maybe they were going to the same place as me. Maybe they didn't even notice they were making me uncomfortable. But deep down, I knew something was off. About 20 minutes later, I saw an exit for a gas station, so I decided to pull off. If they followed me there, I'd know for sure something wasn't right. I took the exit, slowing down as I approached the gas station, and sure enough, the car followed. My stomach dropped. The gas station was one of those small, old ones. Just a couple of pumps and a tiny convenience store. I pulled into the lot, parked by the entrance, and pretended to check my phone. The car pulled in a few seconds later and parked at a pump, but no one got out. Now I was panicking. Why weren't they getting gas? Were they waiting for me to get out of my car? I stayed put, my heart racing, trying to figure out what to do. Should I drive off? Should I go inside? I felt trapped. After a few minutes, the car finally moved, but instead of leaving, they drove to the other side of the lot and parked again, still not getting out. At this point, I was shaking. I decided to call my friend. I didn't want to sound dramatic, but I needed someone to know what was going on. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I think someone's following me." "What? Are you serious?" my friend said. I explained what was happening, and they told me to stay on the line and call the police if I felt unsafe. While we were talking, I saw the car start moving again. This time, it pulled out of the lot and parked on the side of the road, just outside the gas station. The headlights were off now, which somehow made it even creepier. "I think they're waiting for me to leave," I whispered into the phone. "Don't go anywhere yet," my friend said. "Stay where it's lit." I nodded, even though they couldn't see me, and kept watching the car. After a few minutes, a guy got out. He looked normal enough. Jeans, hoodie, baseball cap. But the way he was walking toward the gas station felt deliberate, like he had a purpose. I stayed in my car, trying not to make eye contact as he walked past. He went into the convenience store, but he didn't stay long. A minute later, he came back out and started walking toward my car. My friend was still on the line. "He's coming toward me," I whispered. "Lock your doors," they said. The guy stopped about 10 feet from my car and just stood there, like he was waiting for something. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he turned and walked back to his car. He got in, but he didn't leave. He just sat there, headlights off, like he was watching me. I couldn't take it anymore. I told my friend I was going to drive to the nearest police station. They agreed it was the safest option. I started the car, pulled out of the lot, and headed back to the highway, keeping my eyes on the rear-view mirror. Sure enough, the car followed me. Now I was terrified. I sped up, trying to put some distance between us. But they sped up too. I switched lanes. They switched lanes. I took the next exit at the last second, hoping they wouldn't have time to follow, but they did. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely hold the wheel. I finally saw a sign for a police station and turned into the lot, parking right in front of the entrance. The other car pulled into the lot too, but stopped at the far end. I sat there, watching them, waiting to see what they'd do. After a few seconds, they backed up and sped off, tires screeching as they left the lot. I ran inside and told the officer at the desk what had happened. They asked if I'd gotten the license plate number, but in my panic, I hadn't. They said they'd keep an eye out for the car and offered to have someone follow me home, but I told them I'd just find a nearby motel for the night. I never saw that car again, and I still don't know what they wanted. Maybe it was just a coincidence, or maybe it was something much worse. All I know is, ever since that night, I've been way more cautious when I'm driving alone. I'm a paramedic, and this happened literally the day before Thanksgiving, a detail that becomes relevant later. It had been a long shift filled with routine calls, fender benders, slips on icy sidewalks, and even a case of frostbite from exposure. Nothing too wild. Then, we got a call over the radio dispatching us to a non-emergent welfare check at a retirement community. We loaded up the ambulance and headed out, meeting fire and police crews outside the residence. To give you a sense of the place, this was no stereotypical retirement home. These were luxury, multi-story condos, the kind that would cost you a fortune to live in. That detail stuck with me because of what happened next. We made contact with the resident who called us, an older woman named Susan. She greeted us at the door and explained why she was worried. Her roommate, Mary, hadn't left her room in 5 days. Not to eat, bathe, or even use the bathroom. However, Susan was adamant that Mary was still in there. She claimed to have checked on her a few times and saw her lying in bed, occasionally moving slightly. Naturally, I asked Susan all the necessary questions. Did Mary have any pre-existing conditions? Any signs of declining health recently? The answer was no. Other than her age, Mary was supposedly in great shape. After gathering some basic information and grabbing what gear we thought we might need from the ambulance, I decided to head upstairs to try to make contact with Mary myself. The layout of the condo added to the growing unease I was beginning to feel. The staircase was a series of 5 steps, then a landing where you had to pivot, followed by another 5 steps to the top floor. From there, a landing with a banister overlooked the lower level, where my partner, the fire crew, and the officers were still chatting with Susan. The hallway upstairs was lit, but it felt strangely dim and unwelcoming. Cold, even. That's when I realized I'd forgotten to ask Susan which room was Mary's. I called down to her, and she shouted back up that it was the last door on the right. I started down the hallway, passing several dark, open doorways. Each one made my nerves spike just a little more. There was something about the stillness, the way the shadows played in the corners, that made the air feel heavy. By the time I reached Mary's door, I was seriously debating going back downstairs to grab my partner or one of the firefighters, but I shook it off. This was just a routine welfare check, I reminded myself. I knocked on the door. "Hey Mary, this is Kay. I'm with EMS. We got called to come check on you. Is it okay if I come in?" Usually, a knock and an introduction like that would at least get some kind of response. A groan, a cough, something. But not this time. The room was silent. Then I heard it. The faint sound of someone shifting in bed, followed by what unmistakably sounded like footsteps. They stopped somewhere in the middle of the room. The uneasy feeling in my gut tightened into a knot. Something about the sound didn't sit right with me. It was the day before Thanksgiving, a detail that will make this story even stranger. I'm a paramedic, and my partner and I were nearing the end of a shift that had been filled with routine calls, fender benders, slips on icy sidewalks, frostbite cases. Nothing out of the ordinary. That is, until we were dispatched to a welfare check at a retirement community. The call was non-emergent, so we loaded up and headed to the scene, meeting fire and police outside the residence. Now, this wasn't your typical retirement home. These were luxury condos, multi-story and worth millions. A far cry from what most people picture when they hear retirement community. Susan, the elderly resident who had called us, greeted us at the door. She seemed frazzled and explained that her roommate, Mary, hadn't left her room in 5 days, not to eat, bathe, or use the bathroom. Susan assured us Mary was still in the condo. She'd peeked into Mary's room a few times and had seen her lying in bed. Mary even moved occasionally, though not much. I asked all the standard questions about Mary's health, any prior medical issues, recent illnesses, or reasons she might be immobile. Susan didn't know of anything serious. Mary was old, yes, but otherwise in great shape. After gathering some background information and retrieving the necessary gear from the ambulance, I decided to head upstairs to check on Mary. The condo had a unique layout, with a staircase leading to a landing, where it pivoted to another set of stairs before reaching the upper floor. From the top, a banister overlooked the living room below, where my partner, the fire crew, and the police were chatting with Susan. As I climbed the stairs, I realized I hadn't actually asked which room belonged to Mary. I called down, and Susan shouted that it was the last door on the right. The hallway at the top was lit, but it felt oddly dim and cold, as if the light couldn't quite push back the shadows. Walking past several open, dark doorways, I felt a growing unease, a prickling sensation that made me want to turn back and grab someone to come with me. But I pressed on, reaching Mary's door. I knocked. "Hey Mary, this is Kay. I'm with EMS. We got a call to check on you. Is it okay if I come in?" Silence. Usually, these checks elicit some kind of response. A groan, a cough, anything. But there was nothing. Then, I heard what sounded like someone shifting in bed and walking to the middle of the room. I knocked again. "Mary, I'm coming in to make sure you're okay." I turned the doorknob, pushed the door open, and stepped inside. I scanned the room from right to left. At first, I didn't see anything, but as my eyes adjusted, I froze. In the middle of the room stood a figure. It was shaped like an older woman, but it was entirely shadow-like, with no defining features. I couldn't see a face, but I had the eerie sensation it was staring right at me. My fight-or-flight response kicked in hard, and before I even had time to think, I slammed the door shut, turned, and started walking away. Then I heard it. The sound of the door opening behind me. Panic surged through me, and I bolted. At 6'2" and 245 pounds, I'm not exactly a sprinter, but I full-on ran down that hallway. I vaulted over the guardrail at the stairs, landed awkwardly on the landing, and tumbled down the remaining steps. I came to a stop at the feet of my partner, the officers, and the firefighters, who were all deep in conversation. "What the hell happened?" they asked, their faces a mix of concern and confusion. I sat up, adrenaline coursing through me, and tried to explain what I had seen. My words came out rapid and shaky. The shadowy figure, the door opening, the terror I felt. I swore I wasn't going back up there. As I spoke, we all heard it. Footsteps upstairs, moving away from the landing. One of the officers called out, "This is the police! If someone's up there, you need to come out!" He climbed the stairs cautiously. The rest of us watched as he reached the top landing. Then, the door to Mary's room slammed shut. The officer retreated quickly, and he, my partner, and a couple of firefighters went back upstairs to conduct a thorough search. They found nothing. No one was in the condo. When I finally gathered the courage to join them, the atmosphere upstairs had completely changed. The oppressive darkness was gone. The hallway didn't feel cold or menacing anymore. And Mary's room? It looked entirely normal, like a cozy bedroom with no hint of the shadowy figure I'd seen earlier. We regrouped downstairs, baffled. As we were packing up our equipment and preparing to leave, a car pulled into the driveway. Inside was a family of 3 and an elderly woman. It was Mary. Her family explained that they had picked her up 5 days earlier to spend Thanksgiving with them. She had left a note for Susan, but it had fallen off the fridge and slipped underneath it. Mary was completely fine and had no idea about the commotion. To this day, I have no explanation for what I saw. Did my mind play tricks on me in the eerie atmosphere? Was it just a trick of the light? Or was there something else in that room? I don't know. What I do know is that my partner, the police officer, and the firefighters all heard the footsteps and the door slam. When I've asked the officer about it since, he either changes the subject or outright denies anything unusual happened. Whatever it was, it's a moment I'll never forget. It's just one of many strange encounters I've had during my time in EMS. I worked as a dispatcher at a small ambulance station located near a sizable city in the Midwest. Our station handled a range of emergency services, from transporting patients to and from hospitals to responding to 911 calls. One of the most memorable and unsettling experiences I had there involved a patient we'll call Susan. Susan was a dialysis patient, and as part of the services we provided, we regularly transported her to and from her treatments 3 times a week. She lived with her son, David, who was in his late 40s, while Susan was in her late 70s. This routine had been in place for quite a while, years in fact, and Susan and David had become very familiar to all of us at the station. We'd seen her so many times, whether it was the crew picking her up for appointments or talking to her son about logistics over the phone, we were all well acquainted. Then, things started to go a bit off track. One week, Susan wasn't feeling well, but she insisted on going to her dialysis appointment. We took her in as usual, but during the treatment, she lost consciousness and had to be rushed to the hospital. This wasn't uncommon. She was a fragile woman, and sometimes complications arose, but it still threw us for a loop. We followed standard protocol and informed the hospital, and they assured us she'd be taken care of. The next week, when Susan's next dialysis appointment rolled around, we called the hospital to check on her status. The hospital informed us that she would likely be released the next day, and that her dialysis treatment would take place in the hospital. We didn't think much of it at the time, and were relieved to hear that she was recovering. The following treatment day arrived, and we called the hospital again. This time, they informed us that Susan had already been released from care. We were glad to hear that, but we were also a bit confused, since we hadn't been called to transport her to any appointments recently. It was odd, but we moved on quickly and called David to confirm whether Susan would need our services that day. David told us that she was still not feeling well and wasn't up for the appointment. He mentioned that he was considering taking her back to the hospital. We told him to call us if they needed a ride, but until further notice, we canceled her trip for the day. Days passed, and the pattern continued. The next appointment came, and once again, we called David to see if Susan would need transportation. He informed us that she was sick and back in the hospital. Once again, we hadn't been called to transport her anywhere, but it wasn't that surprising. Her health had been declining for some time. The following week, the same story played out. We'd call, David would tell us she was in the hospital, and we'd move on. It was starting to get stranger, but we figured it was just another odd series of events, until things really took a turn. We had a feeling something wasn't right, and that was when the situation started to unravel. The next dialysis appointment came, and as usual, we tried calling David to check on Susan's status. This time, he didn't answer or return any of our calls. Given that we had a standing contract to transport Susan unless explicitly told otherwise, we sent a crew to her home to pick her up for treatment. When the crew arrived, they knocked on the door but got no response. They knocked again, more firmly this time, and eventually, David came to the door. He was smoking a cigarette and looked startled to see them. The crew explained they were there to take Susan to her appointment. David, appearing flustered, apologized and said he had forgotten to call, but that Susan was still in the hospital and not doing well. The crew offered their best wishes for her recovery, and David quickly shut the door. But something felt off. The crew couldn't shake the uneasy feeling they got from the encounter. They immediately radioed back to dispatch, explaining the situation and requesting we verify Susan's status with the hospital. When we called, the hospital informed us that Susan had not been admitted since the last time we checked. Alarm bells went off. Something wasn't right. Following protocol, we instructed the crew to leave the scene and contacted the local police to request a welfare check at David's home. That was the last we heard for the rest of the day. No updates from the police, no calls from David, and of course, no word from Susan. The next morning, as I clocked in, the very first call I received stopped me in my tracks. "This is Sheriff Chubb the caller began. "I'm calling to report back on the welfare check you requested yesterday." My stomach dropped. The sheriff's voice carried a weight of concern that immediately put me on edge. I hadn't expected any follow-up, let alone a phone call from law enforcement. He continued, explaining what the officers found when they arrived at David's home. At first, David had been adamant that Susan was unwell, but resting at home after being discharged from the hospital. The officers, wanting to ensure her well-being, insisted on seeing her to confirm she was all right. After some hesitation, David reluctantly let them inside. What the officers encountered was horrifying. In the dimly lit living room, they found Susan's body, propped up on the couch, wrapped in blankets, as if she were casually watching television. But Susan wasn't resting. She had been dead for approximately 2 weeks. The officers pieced together that David had been dressing her body and placing her on the couch every day, maintaining the illusion that she was still alive. When questioned, David spoke about watching TV with her and changing her clothes regularly, showing signs of profound grief and likely severe mental health issues. The chilling twist: David, who had never been known to care for his mother properly while she was alive, only seemed to have started doting on her after her death. There was no news coverage, no follow-up updates from the police, and no additional details shared with us after that call. It was one of those moments that makes you realize how many unsettling things can happen in your community without anyone ever knowing. It's haunting to think about how easily this could have gone unnoticed, and how much we still don't know about the depth of David's state of mind or what led to such a tragic and disturbing situation. I'm a paramedic in the southern United States, and have been working in emergency medical services and volunteer fire service since my senior year of high school. 7 years at the time of this story. Over those years, I've witnessed my fair share of strange and harrowing events. Some were explainable, others not so much. I've dealt with violence directed at both my patients and myself. I've been punched, kicked, bitten, rammed by patients trying to escape an involuntary hold, cut, and even stabbed with a used needle by a guy furious about having his blood drawn after a DUI crash. But none of those incidents come close to the night I'm about to describe. It wasn't just what happened to me, or what could have happened to my partner, but the chilling lead-up and the unsettling lack of resolution afterward that made it unforgettable. This happened in November 2011. I was working for a large, nationally recognized ambulance company, which is no longer around thanks to a merger. At the time, we held the contract to provide 911 service for a mostly rural county in western Tennessee. It was a great job if you loved being a paramedic. 1 or 2 calls a day, usually serious emergencies, and a heavy dose of domestic violence and drug-related incidents. That night was miserable. Cold, rainy, and dark. We got a call from local deputies requesting our assistance at the scene of an assault. The call was logged as a woman down, unresponsive. We flipped on our lights and sirens and headed out. My partner that night, who we'll call Alex, was an EMT about my age and 6 months pregnant. She was petite, standing 5'2", with a calm and gentle demeanor, not someone who would come across as imposing. I'm 5'7", about 180 pounds at the time, and far from a commanding presence myself. I'm introverted, a bit goofy, and definitely not the take charge type unless the situation absolutely demands it. When we pulled up to the scene, the first thing I noticed was how strange everything felt. This was an older neighborhood, filled with homes built before WA2. The house was a shotgun-style design, meaning one room led directly into the next, with no hallways. The only light came from the flashing blue strobes of the deputies' cars, parked about 50 yards away on the main road. None of the officers were near the house, and no one was performing first aid. A lone deputy met us at the door, explaining that the husband claimed he had come home to find his wife, face down on the living room floor. The husband had also said he knew his brother was responsible. The deputy warned us that the husband seemed drunk, and then, oddly, disappeared back to his car, without waiting for us to enter. We stepped inside, and the situation immediately felt even more off. The house was eerily quiet, and the husband, who should have been there, was nowhere in sight. That should have been a red flag, but our focus was on the woman lying on the floor between the couch and a living room table. A recliner sat in one corner of the room, and a closed door led to another part of the house. The woman was in bad shape. Her face was swollen and unrecognizable, her scalp split open, and she was completely unconscious. Bruises covered her body, some fresh and others in various stages of healing, a clear indication of ongoing abuse. But there was no time to dwell on the situation. We got to work stabilizing her, placing a neck collar and starting an IV. In our focus, we didn't hear the bathroom door creak open. It wasn't until I heard the unmistakable metallic click of a shotgun being loaded that I realized someone else was there. I straightened up from where I'd been crouched, tending to the woman, and turned to face a towering figure. The man was at least 6'2", massively built, and clearly drunk. His face was twisted in a menacing scowl, his hands calmly loading 2 shells into a sawed-off shotgun. "I'm going to get them," he muttered, his voice low and steady. His eyes locked onto mine with a gaze so full of rage, it felt like it could cut me in half. The smell of alcohol was overpowering, and his sweat-soaked shirt clung to his jittery frame. Behind me, Alex was at the door with her back turned, trying to get the stretcher off the porch. She had no idea what was happening inside. My mind raced, heart pounding, as I stared down the barrel of the shotgun in his hands. It felt surreal, like I was watching a nightmare unfold on a screen, except I was the one in the scene. Everything I'd learned in training, if the scene isn't safe, get out, flashed through my mind. But running wasn't an option. He'd shoot me before I made it 2 steps. As I stood up from his wife, keeping my eyes locked on his, I managed to speak, my voice steady but firm. Alex, get out. Now. Alex must have turned and seen him, because her scream echoed through the house. I repeated myself, slow and deliberate. Alex, get out. Now. I'll be fine. My goal was clear, to place myself between this man and my pregnant partner. She bolted, running down the driveway, screaming for the deputies. The man didn't move, his eyes boring into mine as he loaded the shotgun with a mechanical precision. His face twisted into a chillingly calm expression as he growled, "I'm going to get them who did this. Get out of my way, or I'll kill you too." His words cut through me like ice, his voice devoid of anything but rage. I thought it might be some cruel, sick prank. My nervous laugh betrayed me as I blurted out, "Well, please don't miss." He didn't laugh. He didn't flinch. He just stood there, aiming the barrel of the shotgun at my face. Panic bubbled under my skin, but I held it together. "If you shoot me," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, "she's going to die. I'm the only one who can help her." He stared for a moment, unblinking, and then responded coldly. "She dies. You die." He moved to sit in the recliner across from me, the shotgun still in his lap, and gave me a toothy grin. It wasn't the kind of smile you'd expect from someone trying to put you at ease. It was the kind that sends shivers down your spine. His wide eyes locked onto me with a terrifying intensity as I worked to stabilize his wife, trying not to think about what would happen if he decided he was done talking. My hands trembled as I pretended to busy myself with bandaging his wife's wounds. I couldn't stop picturing what would happen when he pulled the trigger. The shotgun's blast, the splatter of blood, the nothingness that would follow. Then he spoke again, his tone unnervingly casual. "My brother makes me do this. He made me do all that, you see. She was cheating on me. I had to. I didn't want to hurt her. She made me." His words sent chills through me, especially paired with that grin and his trembling, sweaty frame. I was running out of things to do to keep up the facade that I was saving her, and every second felt like an eternity. That's when I finally heard the shouting and saw the blinding flashlights. Deputies stormed in, weapons drawn, yelling at him to drop the shotgun. He hesitated, then let the gun fall to the floor. In an instant, they had him on the ground, cuffing him as he screamed and sobbed incoherently about how his brother was to blame and how none of it was his fault. Shaking and barely able to stand, I forced myself to focus long enough to get the patient loaded into the ambulance. My partner and I drove her to the trauma center, silent the whole way. Afterward, we filed incident reports and gave statements to the deputies. Then, nothing. No follow-up, no explanation. It was as if the entire incident was swept under the rug. Fast forward to 2013. By then, I was working for a different ambulance service. One day, while picking up a patient at the county hospital, I ran into Alex. We started reminiscing about that night, treating it like some morbid joke, laughing to keep from crying. But then Alex pulled me aside, her tone suddenly serious. She told me the rest of the story, and that's when I realized just how close I had come to dying that night. The woman had regained consciousness a day after the attack. She told the hospital staff her husband had been drinking heavily and hadn't taken his medication. That night, he started accusing her of sleeping with his brother and beat her until she hit the living room table and blacked out. He eventually pled to a domestic violence charge and was sent to an inpatient psychiatric facility. But here's the horrifying twist. His brother had been dead for nearly a decade, killed in a car accident in 2002. According to the wife, her husband suffered from severe hallucinations, vivid, lucid ones. He saw his brother regularly, and in those visions, his brother gave him commands, told him what to do. That night wasn't the first time the brother had driven him to violence. The deputies knew the house had a history of mental health-related calls. They knew about his condition, yet they didn't flag the address or warn us when we were dispatched. Worse, despite his clear threat to me and Alex, no charges were ever filed for what he did, or almost did, to us. To this day, the memory raises more questions than answers. Why did the deputies leave us alone in such a dangerous situation? Why wasn't he charged for threatening us? And why wasn't there more support for what we went through? It's a chapter of my life I'll never forget, and one that left me with a haunting understanding of how fragile the line between safety and chaos can be.